A few months back, really closer to a year ago, a friend of mine suggested that we do something interesting with our night for once. He told me about how he had been to one of the city's cemeteries after dark a few times, and that it terrified him, but in that sort of way that makes it worthwhile. I was a little against it at first, because the cops like to check on the area often, and there was no way we were going to be walking into the graveyard sober. Of course, however, my mind changed when we got to talking. "You know about the witch?" He started cracking a grin. "I think so." I had heard very little. "Remind me, just in case." "So there's supposed to be this witch or ghost or some crap, and I know right where the grave is." Jesus, alright. I don't know exactly what I believe, but I know that the place is messed up. He paused, thinking hard. I said, "I honestly don't believe in anything, but a dark graveyard is scary anyway. Definitely need to check it out sometime if we don't get to it tonight." He popped up with, "Oh man, I just remembered there are these dead kids." "What?" "There's a bunch of graves together for this one family, and a bunch of them are these kids. That spot is extra creepy. They're all old as hell, from like the 1800s or something." "Well, I guess we gotta go see all of it." We pulled into the lot when the sun was setting and decided to smoke a little bit in the car since we had time anyway. As we smoked, the whole place emptied out, and we were the only ones in sight. By this point, we were at a comfortable level of dissociative perfection, so we brought just a little bit of it with us. And, of course, my pack of cigarettes, which is no longer a habit of mine, but at the time was a means for managing stress. So, off we went, with a bit of sun still shining and one single truck riding through the cemetery. We figured it would be good to wait for the truck to leave, assuming it was a worker watching for any unwanted guests. Although they had left the gates wide open, we were a little unsure of the legality of being around after dark, and a little bit uneasy about some psycho employee ratting on us and getting us caught with what we had. After about 10 minutes and 3 or 4 rounds of the truck passing by, we figured it would be smart to just go ahead and hide wherever we were if he passed by us again. We made our way down the main hill that leads into the center of the cemetery, and we noticed a chill that seemed to pass as we entered the real part. I passed it off as a weird current made by the creeks and the cooler air in that area, but a part of the primal fear that remained in the back of my mind made me question my devotion to reality. There were a few times where we had to hide behind a tree as the truck made its way back around, and then we would make a few more minutes of progress. As we began to become too close to sober, we imbibed a bit more. Another 30 minutes or so passed, and we had decimated almost our entire on-hand supply. We also had no clue where we were. As we wandered along the dark, winding roads, we started to get concerned about our phone batteries. His phone was worse off than mine, being near dead already, although mine was hardly doing better. After deciding to keep them in our pockets for the time being, the dark and discomforting silence started to make both of us paranoid. It was, of course, a bit heightened by our habits. We also noticed something else that was upsetting. We had started to go around in circles. As we realized this, I had the first real wave of fear for that night come rushing over me. I could swear that someone was inside one of the mausoleums with their face just barely out of view and moving around in the shadows. Dude, do you see that? On instinct, I grabbed for my inhaler. "What? What the hell are you talking about?" my friend said. "In that, right there." I looked toward the window rather than pointing. I swear to Christ, I just saw someone in there. I saw the shadow of a face. My friend brushed me off. "You're just freaked out because you smoked too much. It's nothing. Come on, we need to get to the witch, and then we can get the hell out of here." "You still want to go see that?" "Well, yeah. If you don't want to, that's cool, but I'm gonna." I mean, alright, I'm cool with doing that, but I'm just getting a little out of it. About 3 cigarettes and another hour later, we heard something unnerving. At first, we assumed that it was a bunch of drunk teenagers, based on the volume and range of noises being made. Walking further, we found a sign for construction, and being high, we thought it made perfect sense that a group of construction workers must be around. You know, for some good nighttime, silent construction work. Then the voices began to get a bit too quiet for our comfort. We booked it, barreling in no real direction, and somehow ending up at the place. "Here it is," my buddy exclaimed. "This is it?" I looked to a massive circle of tall, dry grass. "Is it in the middle of this?" "No, man," he replied. "It's way in the back." "Come on, I'll show you." I put another cigarette to my mouth with a slight tremble in my hand and followed him through the pitch black and to a large stone structure in a patch of dirt. It was the family he had mentioned, and it made my stomach turn. The cold, rushing wave of fear came back, but it was too late to change my mind. We walked onto the large stone slab and then around it. As we walked around it, he pulled his phone back out to read the headstones. I was nervous with his light being on at this point, after being near those people that we had seen. After a minute, he turned to me. "You want to see the really messed up part?" "Messed up how?" I asked. "The forgotten children. Their graves are back there down a skinny path." He motioned toward the trees. "You down?" "Well," I said, "I've got my smokes. Let's go." We looked at the graves, and my stomach turned, but I was unsure of why. I disliked the idea of dead kids, but my demeanor would never call for me to feel as sick as I did at that moment. Then my friend flipped his phone light back on to read off the names and dates. I started to really become anxious at that point, even voicing it. I scanned the woods, unable to see anything. My friend told me to just calm down, that the people we had seen had probably left by now. Then we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the woods. At most, it was 50 feet away. It was an unusual scream, aggressive almost. It didn't sound as if someone were hurt, but more that they were threatening us. I was sure at the time that it was a woman, but the hopeful side of me likes to imagine that we just heard some animal. As we paced back down the path toward the stones at the base, I pulled a few cigarettes from my pocket and began to light them like crazy. This was pushed further by my friend stopping to read more stones, as we saw no one following us. Within 10 minutes he had had his fill, and we continued back into the main area. After even more walking, we passed a group of cars parked in a grass patch. We assumed they must have belonged to the group of people from earlier, but we began to wonder why more than 1 or 2 people would be there for so long. Then we got lost for real. Deep in the back of the property, we found the witch's spot, but nothing of interest, so we decided to head back. By now his phone had died, so we used mine to get a map up. We had 30 minutes of walking to get through to get to the car. Halfway back, we started hearing voices again, loud and brash. However, as we got closer, they got less energetic. I peered ahead and froze, grabbing my friend and shushing him. I could see 3 large shadows right down the path from us. I also forgot my phone screen was on, and heard something I'll never forget. "Wait," a deep voice murmured. "Do y'all see that?" "See what?" A second man joined in. "That, right there." The silhouette of his arm pointed directly to us. "That light." I slapped my phone screen against my torso, panicking in an attempt to turn it off. Both of us held our breath, staying still as statues while that group kept discussing. "Go check it out then," chimed a woman's voice. "Or are you too scared?" "Why don't you stay here and check it out while we leave?" "Oh, screw off," she teased, in a way that helped me think they were decent people. We started to shimmy toward the patch of graves to our side, hoping they would forget about us and leave like they had said. But then we saw what kind of people they really were. The first man hushed both of the others, and nearly gave me a heart attack. Let's get 'em." Both men darted toward us, but we were out of sight by then, low to the ground by the hill that we had run across, hiding. We heard them making their way around the area, and we somehow circled behind them, making it out. Then we heard cars starting. For about 20 minutes, these psychos circled through the paths looking for us, and it cost us another half-hour overall. Exhausted, we made our way to the entrance, with an empty cigarette box, an empty bag, and a little bit of paranoia. We got back to his place and spent at least another hour talking about how insane that all of it had been, and then we had a thought. A ridiculous, but unnerving thought. What if we saw nothing at the witch's spot, because she had been in the woods by the family? And then an even worse thought popped up. What if the scream wasn't aggressive like I thought, and those people had done something to someone right near us? Whatever really happened, I know one thing. I'm never going back there without a full group of friends and fully charged phones. This happened to me back in 2008 when I was 14, so my memory is a little fuzzy. My mom, brother, and I drove deep into the sticks of Tennessee from Texas to visit. We were only staying for the weekend. My mom, aunt, and grandmother were talking, and I don't know how we got to this conversation, but my aunt was telling me how she heard about this abandoned church that was supposedly haunted. If you went to the church and took the stick that kept the door closed and put it somewhere else, when you came back, it would be in its original place. There was a statue of an angel, and if you shined a light in its eyes at night, they would bleed. She was spending the night at a friend's house, and her friend also had another friend over that she wasn't familiar with. Her two friends decided to go out to this church at night, in the early hours of the morning. It was pitch black because it's out in the country. They lay a Ouija board on the truck and start asking questions. Basically, some spirit named John says that he was murdered by a gunshot some year in the early 1800s. I swear in this town there are more dead people than there are alive people. I don't actually know that, but it sure seems like it. The last question that they asked was, "Where are you?" and the planchette flew off the board. They decided they didn't want to look for it. Part of me wonders if it's still at the church and where it would be. So they checked the gravestones nearby and found John. Then they thought that they heard a gunshot and ran back to the truck and went home. I said I wanted to go to the church. She took me, my brother, and my cousin who were the same age. It was about a 45-minute drive to get there, and the road that it was on was empty, nothing but grass. There was no way that you could walk there. Across the street was a field that went on for miles, and on either side of the church was just grass and trees. No streetlights. So when we get there, it's a one-room, white, little church. It's surrounded by trees toward the outside of the fence. The fence was black iron, and the opening was big enough for trucks to come through. We saw the creepy angel statue that my aunt had mentioned. We thought it looked like the Reaper. We pull up, and the gate is already open. Immediately, my brother and my cousin, who were in the back seat, were like, "Oh no, we are not going in there." And my aunt was saying, "Why is the gate open? I just don't understand." And I had my hand on the handle, and I looked at the gate. And I knew that something was waiting for me on the other side. I could see, maybe my mind made it up, but I didn't see it with my physical eyes. A ghostly white man with yellow, crooked teeth maliciously smiling at me. So I take my hand off the handle and say, "Okay, I want to go home." So my aunt backed out and went down the road a little bit further, and the closest thing next to us to turn around at, because there were little ditches on the side of the road in case it rains, was another graveyard. Not surprising. We passed by the church, and I wasn't expecting her to stop, but she did to take a photo with a digital camera, and the door was open to the church. We were all freaked out, and I swear I had this feeling like we needed to leave because something was going to chase us. When we got home, the three of us couldn't stop looking at the camera. The thing I remembered the most was that the treetops grew into a face. It looked like a big bald man with a crooked nose and a narrow chin. When my aunt got the picture developed, there were 4 orbs. 1 by the gate, 1 by the door, and 2 by the window. My brother and cousin swore that they had seen green eyes looking out of that window. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like something was hovering over me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I kept praying that nothing would happen. I tried watching TV to shake it off, but damn, there was no shaking it. I didn't sleep until I got back to Texas. That was my last night in Tennessee, and when I went back home, I slept with my light on every night for a while. And while we were there, I could just sense this unbelievable amount of hate from whatever was there. It was so aggressive and ready to attack. That feeling just pierced through you. That's my only experience. I will never doubt that there is a spirit world after that. My aunt sent me the picture, but I tore it up in 2012 because I was afraid that it would bring something bad into the house. I went camping on a hiking trail in the Shawnee State Forest. During the day, I set up camp and went fishing in a creek running along next to the campsites. Most of the day, I felt fine and peaceful. I tend to feel at home in the woods alone and fly fishing. I started a fire, started on dinner over the fire before it got dark, and stoked the fire. Once it got dark, I felt compelled to keep the fire stoked, and a feeling of panic would set in if it even began to die down. I couldn't relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. It got to the point where I just grabbed my light and walked out, leaving all of my stuff there. I got out to the parking lot about 1.5 miles away and tried to steel my nerves and go back, but couldn't step past the tree line. I waited all the way until morning to go back to get my stuff, and the feeling was gone. I got everything together and left. Haven't been back since. I don't know if it was a ghost or a native spirit, since this place is deep in what used to be Shawnee tribe land. This took place a few years ago. I was with my best friend and we decided to go camping at a campsite in Flagstaff named Lockett Meadow. We had taken our dogs. After a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside of our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body, and my dog, who was curled up awake and not moving or making a sound, was at the bottom of my feet. I look over and see my best friend passed out, and his dog, which I'm unsure if it was awake, but clearly I was the only one between my friend and I that's experiencing this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything else that might make me fall asleep. The next day I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake through all of that. I explained what had happened. He replied no, and thought that I was just making it up. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite, but couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had food out on a table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch, so even if it was a bear, I'm really surprised that it didn't get into any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared shitless I was, seeing this dark object observing our tent. Could it somehow have been the wind? A deer? Who knows? But this is just one encounter out of the whole trip. The next night we decide to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona. Before we wanted to settle in, we explored Sedona. We drove to Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down by the water. We took our dogs and hiked to the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming, we dried off and were about to head out. Next thing you know, in our peripheral vision, we see a giant rock being thrown near us. It makes a huge splash in the water. We look up and don't see anything above, so we ran over stones and rocks to get a clear view of the top, and still see no one. We yell out taunts and curse words, but still heard no one running off or any kind of sound in response. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me that throughout the trip since we started in Flagstaff, he had rocks being thrown at him, right up until that giant one at Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought that maybe someone was following behind us, messing with us. Then we sort of laughed it off and said no, that was impossible, that we were just trying to connect the dots to have it be a cool look-back adventure. Well, I'm glad that it didn't turn into a part 3, because nothing happened that night, or the next day, where we packed up and headed home with nothing more than a memory that we wanted to rationalize. When I was a child, my family often spent the weekends or the holidays at my grandmother's house. As a typical traditional Malay house, the house was made out of wood and was quite huge. Not a surprise, since my father does have a lot of siblings, 9 of them. It wasn't just my immediate family. Most weekends or holidays, even my uncles and aunt would be there too, along with their family. Sometimes there would be around 50 to 70 of us inside that house. It was truly one of my fondest memories, where the entire huge family would sit together to have dinner or celebrate birthdays or whatever. One day, my grandmother fell sick. The doctor simply told us that her health was deteriorating since she was quite old at the time, but that she required no hospitalization. My dad and his siblings all made up their mind that my grandmother should stay with them. Every month, she would stay with a different one of her children at their house. I remember she stayed the most at my house, since it was the biggest at that time. I was happy, since she was a great storyteller and a great cook. In the meantime, my father and uncles hired a nearby neighbor to take care of and clean my grandmother's house every once in a while. Unfortunately, her health continued to decline. She told my father that she wanted to stay in her old home. At first, we didn't like the idea with her being alone in that house, especially with her declining health. After much discussion, my eldest uncle decided to build a house directly in front of my grandmother's house for him to stay in. In the meantime, they would rent a nearby house so that he or my cousins could visit her every day. My father and his siblings also agreed to hire a nanny for my grandmother so that she would never be alone. Fortunately, despite no one having been staying in the house for about 2 years, it was relatively clean. It had been almost a week since my grandmother returned to her own home. The weekend was coming, and my father decided to bring back the tradition of staying at my grandmother's. That Friday night, around 2 of us were there, and that night strange things began to happen. The first to notice that something was off were my cousins. They were all the daughters of Dad's youngest sibling. They were always cheerful, but at that time, I remember their faces almost always looking terrified. I chalked it up to them just being kids, which was ironic since I was only around 10 myself at that time. Then, as I walked past their bedroom, I heard through the thin wall that the girls complained to their parents that they had noticed a few shadowy figures, which had been all over the house. My uncle tried to convince them that it was just their imagination. I decided not to care much. I was too tired and sleepy. That night, while I was sleeping, I remember waking up and staring above and seeing something terrifying. Just so you know, a traditional Malay house rarely has a ceiling. The house beam was exposed, and you can see the inside layer of the roof. During my sudden awakening, I saw something like a shadow sitting on the house beam. I had to rub my eyes to see, and after a while I began to make out what it was. It was some sort of creature or something. Am I still dreaming? I thought to myself. I was utterly terrified. I could see the creature, but it was like my brain failed to see exactly how it looked. Sometimes it would look like a lion, then a crocodile, then a huge bird or some other kind of animal. And then it looked at me. All I could remember was its huge red eyes and a wide grin filled with fangs. I tried to scream, but my voice stuck in my throat, and my body felt stiff, as if I were paralyzed. All I could do was slowly pull up the blanket and hide my body underneath it, and force myself to go back to sleep, hoping that it was a nightmare. The next day, as I sat alone at the stairs, trying to get rid of the memories of what happened, from the corner of my eyes, I could sense that someone or something had been peeking out from the toilet area looking at the living room. It appeared to be a child, or was the size of a child, with pale, gray skin. Another time I was sitting in a chair in the living room. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but it happened throughout the day and the night. That same child. Then I heard my aunts talking with each other. It turns out that I wasn't the only one who had noticed it. The entire family had seen it too. Or rather, we could only see it through the corner of our eyes. When we all turned to look at it directly, it disappeared. Some decided to check it out themselves, and yet, nothing would ever be there. My uncle quietly told us that when a house was abandoned, there will always be something that will live there. That house had been abandoned for 2 years before, so obviously something had moved in, and we were all simply intruders. He told us that if we didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother us. That night we all prayed together, as well as recited some holy prayers. Yet I could still see the little stalker, and I could begin to notice a few shadows around the house that did not belong to the furniture or to the other people living there. Worse for me was at night. I woke up again, and this time the thing was already grinning at me with what I assumed a hand or finger poking at my cheek. It didn't feel solid at all. It felt more like a cloud of smoke. Again, I tried to scream, but my body felt stiff. Like before, I could only slowly pull my blanket to cover my head and force myself back to sleep. I never dare to sleep at that house ever again. Anytime we ever went back to my grandmother's house, during either weekends or holidays, I simply stayed at my uncle's house that was right in front of it. Yet every time I entered there, I could still sense the small figure poking its head out from the bathroom wall and the shadows that would be moving around. My grandmother passed away around 8 years ago, and since then we never have had reason to stay at that house. Now, the house was downsized while I was at university, yet it still has the original layout of the lower area. They only actually got rid of the upper area. I asked my father why not simply demolish the entire building. He then told me that even getting rid of the upper area was difficult. Workers were pushed by nothing, and electronics and engines would always malfunction. In the end, they decided not to touch the bottom area and just continue to use it as storage. My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful and we were set up over the river on this long abandoned bridge. If you've ever been in the Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception. But it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike our way in, approximately 1/10 of a mile from where we had parked. We explored around the area for a bit, and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name, Mona, written in ash on a rock of the fire ring. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up, but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other in the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My thought at first had been somehow that headlights had come through, but I would have heard a car and no man-made light could get to us in this isolated area. This blue light was unlike anything I had ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife, but didn't want to freak her out, so I dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the end of the bridge 30 feet away and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot off into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot away 40 times as quickly as any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that exact spot for the next 10+ minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. This is the only time I have ever had a threatening contact or experience. In June of 2019, me and a friend had decided to go with our girlfriends on a camping trip. It's the day of, and we're packing all of our things into the car. We finally get everything loaded and get into the car and put the address in the GPS. We set off, and after 3 hours of driving and 45 minutes of hearing my friend and his girl argue, we finally arrive. We get out of the car, and me and my friend begin to unload. After getting my stuff, I begin to gather my girlfriend's things. As I was, my friend was asking his girlfriend why she needed 3 bags for a one-night camping trip. She smiled and opened one of them, which contained an ounce of pot and other paraphernalia. The other 2 bags had her favorite snacks and clothes. Now knowing that we had weed, we had to find a place to camp that wasn't near any other people. It took until sundown, but we discovered the perfect spot. We decided that after we got everything taken care of, we would eat hot dogs and smoke. We started to build a campfire to light the area so that we could set up our tents, but ran out of wood immediately. I said that I would go get some while my friend stayed with the girls. I set off on my journey, and after about 2 minutes I find some sticks to use. I start picking them up, and all of a sudden, I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked up to see a very pale, strange-looking man wearing a blank expression. For a man, he also had surprisingly long fingernails. He was digging them into my wrist while trying to grab my other wrist. I turned my head to not see his face and screamed for help, and my friends shouted a response, saying that they were coming. After they shouted, I immediately felt relief in my wrist. I wasn't struggling to keep my arms down, so I turned and ran as fast as I could, horrified. I met up with my friends and said that we had to leave immediately. I didn't even bother to explain myself. I just wanted gone. We loaded back up and took the long walk back. We get to the car and load our bags into it. I explained what happened as we were walking back, and it scared them enough to make them want to hustle. I had a picture of my wrist right after, but my iPhone broke and my cloud wasn't backed up, so I lost it. I do have a picture of it now, though. It has since then become a scar, which shows just how much force he was using. It was absolutely terrifying. I'm employed as a policeman, and I work the night shift in a tiny little town. The population here barely breaks 1,000. Needless to say, I know the town well enough to be able to tell when something is wrong. Near the center of the town, there's the old school they used before they built the new elementary and high schools. The building is listed as a historical site and can't be demolished, but due to asbestos, renovations would cost the town too much to be worth the work. This school sits within feet of the public library, and behind it sits the town's fairground. It isn't an official fairground, but every year they had bull riding and small shows that they would put on for kids during the summer. With all of those details out of the way, I will explain what happened. I noticed the backlight to the library on, which is not normal since it wasn't on all night, and it isn't a motion light, so I parked on the north side of the old school grounds. I walked through the fence and had to pass the school to get to the library. I would stop every few feet and listen because the gravel was so loud. When I stopped the second or third time, I thought I heard a squeal in the school, like the sound of a door. At first, I didn't think anything of it, since I figured I was hearing things. The town just replaced all the windows on this building, so I thought I wouldn't be able to hear the inside. When I investigated the light and found all the doors locked, I started walking back around to my car. As I passed by the school again, I heard a noise in the building again, and I stopped and listened. And as I shined my light, I noticed a basement window was broken out. So when I walked up to the window, I looked down and in, and didn't see anything. I kept walking, and I heard the squeal again. It reminded me of those bathroom doors in schools that the hinges always squealed really loud and echoed. When I came around the corner, I saw 2 cats roughhousing in the dirt. They stopped to watch me, and then both of them turned and looked at the door. I couldn't see for myself because it was around another corner. One hissed, and they both bolted away from the school, which put me on edge. I know this school is absolutely not in use, nor are there any plans to use this school anytime soon. Also, the local kids and homeless don't come here, ever. It's a landmark the city as a whole really admires, and there hasn't ever been an issue with breaking and entering, at least not for a long time. So when I came around the corner, I saw the door and I walked up to it to see what the cats had run from. I looked for other animals, but that didn't make sense because they looked up as if someone were standing in the window of the door. Not like they would if it were a raccoon or a dog that ran off without me seeing. When I looked in the window with my light, I could see a gigantic Raggedy Ann painted on the wall, and I assumed this was the kindergarten section or something. And then I stepped back from the door getting ready to leave, and I heard whistling. It wasn't really loud, but it was loud enough to make me stop. That little voice in the back of my head was talking now and telling me I was just hearing things, but the dude that likes the dump of fear of the unknown told me to go back to the door. So I went back and listened again, and I know it was whistling, and not like the squeak of an animal or an object from inside. It got louder when I came to the door again, and it had a tune, but I don't know how to describe it. So now, thinking someone is in the school, I went around and checked all the doors, including the second floor door that I had to climb the rusty metal stairs that were more like a death trap to see in through. When I couldn't find a way into the school, I checked it all over again, and when I left, I couldn't figure out what it was. The whistling had stopped, and I even hung around outside for a few minutes without my light on, just watching, figuring out if someone was in there. They would eventually need to use a light to get around, or to get back out, but there was nothing after 20 or so minutes. So I got in my car, circled the block, and parked down the way with my lights off to watch for someone to come out at some point. But no one did, and there haven't been any lights on. I know this story seems kind of boring compared to the others, but working nights gets you on edge. And for all the things I know I experienced before, this was in my top 5 bone-chilling moments while on the job. Although I've had several paranormal experiences in my life, I was always a skeptic. I try to debunk my own experiences. Like, what if I was just tired? There must be a logical explanation. However, this experience made me a believer. A few years ago, I visited my friend who lives abroad. We decided to go inside an old amusement park that had been abandoned years ago. As a kid, my friend had visited the place every week, so it was pure nostalgia for her. We snuck through a hole in the fence and entered the park. The place was taken back by nature, mostly overgrown and with small, swampy little puddles everywhere. We were nervous about snakes hiding in the grass, and about the big pack of feral dogs roaming the property. But the paranormal hadn't crossed our minds. Upon entering the park, the dogs barked at us, warning us to leave them alone, so we avoided the area where they were and went on exploring. We seemed to be the only people there. After a good 30 minutes or so, we stumbled upon an empty karaoke bar. The place felt off somehow, not like the other buildings we encountered. My friend explains that this building is not what it seems. Karaoke bars in her country are often a cover for alcohol consumption, which was illegal back then, and prostitution. She doesn't recognize the place, which is weird since she spent a big part of her childhood at the park. We figured that it must have been a bit hidden away from the crowds, since it was most likely linked to illegal activity. The moment that we entered the building, my attention was immediately drawn toward a creepy door with a broken glass panel. You could see that there was nothing on the other side, but somehow the darkness behind the door seemed more solid than the door itself. I stared at it for at least a good 15 seconds before I tell myself to stop freaking out about a door. While we explore the first floor, I hear footsteps right behind me. Thinking it was my friend, I turn around, ready to make a stupid joke about her creeping up on me, but she isn't there. I see her at the other end of the room, at least 8 meters away from me. I chalk it up to weird acoustics and don't tell her about it. Do you know that feeling you get when people are staring at you? That's how the second floor felt. It was as if we had walked into a crowded room, except that no one was there. Like on the first floor, the darkness of some unlit areas somehow seemed too dark, more solid. I became increasingly nervous, but I didn't tell my friend since I didn't want to sound crazy. Soon, my friend stopped in her tracks and said that she wasn't comfortable exploring any further. She later described that room as a quote-unquote black hole. She recalls feeling as if all her movements were slower than normal and as if her brain were foggy. This was right above the door that freaked me out so much. Back on the first floor, we feel silly for even being that nervous, and we try to overcome our fears. I decide to open a door adjacent to the freaky door, which was easier said than done. The door was stuck, and I had to put my weight behind it to get it to open. We caught a glimpse of a small storage room before the door was slammed shut again. We almost made a run for it, but since we stubbornly didn't want to give in to our fears and be wusses, we took a few more pictures of the room before we left. Once outside, we rationalized it by saying that it must have been some sort of animal, a stray dog maybe, but we were not convinced. Opening the door took some strength, so what animal could have closed it with such force? There was barely any space between the open door and the wall, so I doubt that it could have been a person hiding there. We talk for a bit to lighten the mood, and we feel braver now that we're outside again. We decide to visit her favorite attraction next, the pirate ship. In the past, it would swing back and forth, but now we couldn't get it to move no matter how much we tried. We both pushed against it with our full body weight, but the ship just wouldn't budge. We take a few photos while we chat about my friend's memories of the park. All of a sudden, the pirate ship begins to move. Slow at first, so slow that I thought that I had imagined it, but then it started to swing more clearly. Since we don't feel the creepy vibes that we felt at the karaoke bar, we decide to stay and watch. After a few minutes, my friend remarks that we should head back soon, since she wouldn't want to be in this place after dark. Immediately after those words left her mouth, it got darker, as if it were suddenly twilight. Remember the dogs who barked when we entered the park? They had been quiet since they realized that we were not a threat. But now, they go wild, barking and howling in the distance. My friend and I don't hesitate, and make a run for it. We run through the dark, overgrown park while the dogs go crazy. It was surreal. Once we reach to the hole in the fence, we crawl out as fast as we can, and suddenly, we feel safe again. I swear, once outside, the sun was shining bright. We looked up to see if it was just a well-timed cloud that had moved in front of the sun, but we couldn't see anything. To this day, my friend is convinced that something told us to leave, since it got dark right after we decided to go home once it was getting dark. I don't believe in these kinds of theories, but feeling-wise, it genuinely felt as if we had went through some sort of gateway when we entered that area. As if it was its own little world. The contrast was just that big. Back home we talked about our experiences. Apparently we both felt uneasy in the karaoke bar long before we actually voiced those feelings. I told her about the creepy vibe I got from the door, and showed her a picture that I took of it when we first entered the building. She tells me she felt the same thing, and took a picture just before we left. Upon comparison, we realized that the door is cracked open a little bit in my photo, but in hers, it's half open. These photos were taken 5 minutes apart, and it seems very unlikely that someone snuck in to open it while we were on the second floor. The dog pack was in a different area of the park, and there was no wind that day. I don't have an explanation, but given our other experiences at the park, this creeped me out even more. Like I said, I have experienced strange things in the past, but nothing like this. In the hour that we spent at that park, I went from a skeptic to a believer. I would love to go back someday and see what happens. When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for one or two neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. Maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. Even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything, but I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right, and I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy or the FBI. Or the finger. But in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid. I was in Pennsylvania exploring an abandoned mill/factory that had been built in the 1800s, at dusk. I was standing on a pile of limestone cinder blocks surrounded by tall grass and brush, with a tree line about an acre away, just after the sun had set, while my friends were inside still. As I was climbing down, I heard a low, guttural growl. Not like a dog's growl, or any type of animal for that matter. It was deep. It had much more bass to it. It was very disturbing and not like anything I have ever heard before. It sounded as if it were very close, but I didn't hear any brush moving. It freaked me out, and I booked it to my friend's house in the dark. If you lived in Canada, then you know that there's a lot of countryside out here, along with forests. Most of the abandoned buildings you might come across are found there. I was 16 when this happened. I grew up mostly in the rougher part of the capital. Yes, even Ottawa has its tough spots, and one is known as Vanier. While it's no Detroit, it's still where most of the poor, along with other drug addicts and homeless, live and stay. I've been through plenty of stuff that a lot of people would say is scary, but this is something that still to this day, at 21 years of age, does not sit well with me. I was with my buddies at a warehouse of sorts. It was pretty deep in the forest. We were drinking and talking when one of my friends brought up the old story of a haunted farm near that spot. He went on about how the guy who got him in brought him there to scare the crap out of him. I want to add that when they went, he did confirm that his friend was the one who was messing with him, but he still said that something was off about it, so we started making jokes. And then I made a joke that got him really serious. I think I said something along the lines of, "There's a ghost in there with Betty White making a porno." He then looks me in the eyes and tells me, "No, something is messed up in there. I don't care what, but I felt it." Me being the jerk that I am, I joked about how he was being the wuss and that the only thing you really have to fear is fear itself. He then convinced me to go to this haunted barn. In retrospect, I should have just shut up right there and then. Next thing I know, we're heading to the barn. We get there, and it's me, my friend, plus this guy that I don't really know, but he was with the group. We walk in, the three of us. Me and the other guy start loudmouthing, right? Wild stuff like, "Hey Casper, what's poppin'?" and "First spirit that comes out gets bopped on sight." I'm not joking when I say that we get halfway in when these heavy, doors shut on us. Those big barn doors, the old ones that took some effort getting them open in the first place, let alone having them swing closed like that. We go to push them open only to find out that they were stuck. So we immediately turn to my friend and start grilling him over trying to trip us up over some fake ghost crap, while Random that was with me starts turning on his flashlight on his phone. I'm asking where our mutual friend is, who I thought was helping him, until I noticed my friend is straight tearing up, which causes me to start freaking out. And I mean freaking out. I'm banging on the door, trying to get homeboy to help, while big homie is acting like a statue. I get a weird feeling on my shoulder. I start to freeze up, and all I hear to my side is scared, as if it were some kind of taunt. I spin around, seeing the same scene as from when I had started freaking. The guy pushing on the door, my friend staring off into nothing. As I'm asking if anyone heard that, the guy pushing the door starts spazzing, saying something in Spanish, I think. I grab him, telling him to calm down, while he's giving me this look like he just got shot. I'm sitting there trying to snap him out of his funk. Then my friend starts ramming into the door over and over really hard. I thought he was going to hurt himself. It was dark. I can't tell exactly what was being thrown around, but I can tell you that a lot was going through the air. We just started hearing crashes from all sides. I even got hit with something. I still have a scar to this day on the left side of my chin and my left shoulder. Then, the screaming. It was like 3 chicks were getting cut up. It was awful. I won't lie, I'm not going to act tougher than I am. I started passing out for the first time, being the most bizarre feeling. My friend grabs me and the random guy, both of us not seeing that he did get the door open. When we got out, I threw up, while the random dude said something that I didn't catch and then just took off. My friend and I looked at each other and started walking back. The entire way he was explaining that he had no part in this. He kept swearing it up and down. I kept ranting about how that this was impossible, and that there was no lock on the door, so how was it even locked? And that caused him to freak out more. I had to go to the doctor to get stitches for whatever it was that flew into me while we were in there. When I told the doctors what happened, which I had to say what happened, but really I should have just made something up, because it could have been anything. And when I told them what did happen, they looked at me as if I were crazy upon my explanation. They actually made me go and see a shrink for a bit, due to my outlandish claims. After a while, they let me off the hook, thinking that I wasn't crazy. All I know is that I was sober that night. Last time I checked, 2 beers don't make you trip out. And random dude is refusing to tell us why he was screaming. Now, for a bit of comparison, when I was 15, I had a shotgun pointed at me and then pressed into my stomach, being threatened that they would pull the trigger. But that's simple. I'm about to get blown up, and that's gun plus angry dude equals body. But that night, I could not explain, nor could I control, or fight back. That night fills me with a terror that has changed my life. And I see how rooms and dark places that I didn't know what was happening or how to react to or defend are the reasons to this day that this was one of the most horrifying experiences I have ever had. Don't get me wrong, getting a gun pointed at me got me on the path where I'm trying to change my life. But I can't change not being able to walk in the dark around my house and my refusal to be in dark rooms. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail that I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to set up my tent. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking, kind of dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book that I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear the sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk/drag across the clearing toward my tent. It was really loud at this point, and now it sounds as if the hooves are being really heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along behind it. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing and stops, and I hear nothing. No breathing. I mean, not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What on earth? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. There was just crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I tried to not let it bother me. Besides, I did have my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, followed by women's laughter and sticks snapping off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. Then I hear more faint laughing from a couple other different directions, all sounding like different people, and confirm that this is real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire off a warning shot into the air in case they come too close. Something about this laughter, how far in the woods that I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night, told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, seeing nothing. I listened intently to my surroundings. There was no more laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. I relaxed just a bit, and figuring that I had scared whoever off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering, not very far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle again and listen to what they were saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I call out again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people that were just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise, back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me. I never saw anyone or anything the entire time, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me. I left all my gear in the woods that night. This is my story from about 4 years ago. I was on a camping trip with some friends when we decided to go a little bit further into the forest to get the best location at the river. We had some beers and went swimming. When it started to get dark, almost all of my friends wanted to go home. Only my buddies Flo and Laura stayed with me. We lit a fire and continued to drink beer. After some hours, I felt like I had to go to the toilet. No problem, even had toilet paper in my backpack. Our camp was located right at the river, and a big field of high grass separated us from the forest. I decided to go to the high grass right in front of the trees, so I grabbed my phone as a flashlight and grabbed the toilet paper and went in the direction of the forest. It was pitch black, and because of the branches of the trees, I couldn't even see into the forest with my flashlight. So I sat down with my back to the forest and started doing my business. I was about 160 feet away from my friends now and couldn't even hear them talking anymore. When I was almost finished, I heard a sound coming from behind me. It was like the rustle of dry leaves or the crackle of branches. I know it's the kind of horror movie stereotype. I stumbled and said, "Hello? Who's there?" 2 or 3 times. But no one answered. I thought it might be some kind of animal, so I screamed as loud as I could. But to my horror, this thing got even closer. I finished as fast as I could, which still felt like an hour to me, while the sound came closer and closer with each passing second. When I stood up and started running, the thing was so close that I expected it to grab me from behind as I tried to escape. So I ran as fast as I could, screaming and crying. When I arrived at our camp, I told my friends everything. They didn't really believe me, but they were pretty scared themselves. I was 17 at the time, big and muscular, and normally not the type of guy to cry. But this thing made me cry, and it would make me again. I could not sleep at all that night. I sat in my sleeping bag, the river to my back, while staring into the direction of the forest. There were no sounds or anything, just the sound of the wind and darkness. In the morning, we packed our stuff and made our way home. I won't go anywhere near that forest anymore. Jokes were often made about me, but I know what I heard, and I get the shivers right now just while writing this. In Germany, we have no dangerous animals living in the forests. But every animal in our forest would avoid contact with humans, especially when you shout at them. My first visit to this hospital was in 2018. After searching for the address for a while, I came across one that looked accurate enough and went on my way to that lost place with a friend of mine. We arrived, astonished by the size of the complex. I didn't do a lot of research before that. I just knew that it used to be a hospital and was built during World War II, and by the address, it seemed legit. On our way down from the parking lot to the lost place, our excitement was growing. But so was our anxiety for reasons that we just couldn't ascertain. We make our way onto the complex at the part where the main entrance was before, and the air felt really dense. My friend felt the same way, but we brushed it off as just being a bit nervous, just ourselves, and we started to walk past some buildings at the entrance, completely focused and being amazed. At some point, my pulse must have slowed down due to me being focused on trying to take in everything I was seeing, because I noticed that it increased in speed when we reached the buildings where I suspected that the patients would have been. It felt like there was strong electricity in the air that made me feel even more uneasy. That's when we heard a door slam behind us at one of the buildings. We, of course, completely froze. The sound came from a building that was pretty far away from us, and that sound was very loud. There was no wind at all that could have caused the heavy doors to slam like that. The trees weren't moving, nor did we hear anything else. Just one door that decided to slam shut on its own. We nervously chuckled and decided to move closer to the exit. I asked my friend if I should record this visit on my phone, and she agreed. We both turned on airplane mode and went on our way. Whether it was due to our anxiety, or us being too alert, or something actually being there, we would turn around or stop walking at the same time, asking the other if we had heard that sound. Sometimes the sounds behind us resembled soft footsteps. Other times we would hear silent whispers that we couldn't quite make out. At some point, I began to question my sanity, but I knew that there had to be something there to make such specific noises, loud enough that my friend would also hear them, as I did. As we were walking toward the actual exit, we stopped to look at one building and we heard a very, very loud bang behind us, making our walking become very determined as we made our way to the main street. The bang was accompanied by other sounds that we couldn't define back then. Fast forward and both of us are at my place. We grab individual headphones and start to listen to the recording. And boy, was that some weird stuff. We both enabled plane mode before I hit the record button, but there were so many disturbances in the recording, distinct sounds like someone coughing, whispers, with clear vowels, that we couldn't quite make out the full words to. A woman's voice going, shh, breathing, and bleeps. I have to admit that we were freaking out a lot. I was almost crying because I found it to be so chilling. The thing that baffled us the most was the loud bang that made us leave. I swear to you, it wasn't there. At all. Not the bang on the recording that startled us so much that made us leave the place, but silent sounds? You can hear us being startled and agreeing to leave immediately, but no bang could be heard on that recording, and it's still not there. I held my phone the exact same way that I had been since I started that recording. I didn't put my clothes against one mic. The mics weren't broken after a test recording that we did. So there should be a banging sound, but absolutely there is not. And I have no clue why that is the case. That hospital is a really special place. From later experiences there, I have come to possible conclusions as to what kind of paranormal things occur. I spent the weekend camping throughout the Northeast, and all was very normal and quite nice. However, last night I camped in Massachusetts in a wooded area between Providence and Plymouth. Nothing felt negative, but I saw lights at least 3 times. The last time was just minutes ago, and that's what prompted me to write this. The lights are very quick, and almost out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what to say or quite how to describe it. I've never seen anything like it. And if it was paranormal, it was very clear. However, each time, they disappeared the second that I looked directly at them. This happened on a hike up to Half Dome. We had a campground about a 20-minute drive away from the trailhead, and the group was composed of me, an 18-year-old male, my uncle, a 32-year-old male, and my uncle's friend, I'll call him D. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christians, so there were no substances consumed that could induce the feelings I will be talking about. We get to our campsite, set up camp, and go to sleep after eating. We plan to wake up at 4 and start to hike by 4:30. I randomly wake up at 3:30 a.m., like completely wide awake, and look out of my hammock, and I remember this odd feeling as if I was woken up by something. I remember looking out at the moonlit scene. The moon was very bright for some reason, and thinking to myself that it looks like a dream. I lay back in the hammock, but can't go to sleep, and end up waking up my uncle and friend at 3:50. My uncle asks me, "Were you walking around at night?" This is important, and I say no and ask why. He says that he woke up for some reason and could hear someone walking around, not like an animal, but a person. I say, "Huh, weird," and we brush it off. We get to the trailhead around 4:30, and as everyone is unloading from the car, Dee says that he's going to use the bathroom, which there are a couple of before the trailhead. I walk behind him for some time before falling behind and waiting for my uncle, who forgot something in the car. The short, straight road from the parking lot runs directly into a T intersection with the road to the trailhead, and the bathroom is directly across from the intersection through a field a little. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for Dee to come out of the bathroom. We wait about 10 minutes before I go and check, and he isn't there. I get back to my uncle and tell him that. He says, "Weird, maybe he went back to the car or something," and we decide to wait a bit more. By 5:10, we begin worrying. My uncle goes to check the car while I wait at the intersection to make sure that we don't miss him if he went down the road away from the trailhead. My uncle returns and says he isn't there either. We decide maybe he went up the trailhead without us for some reason and walk up in there for about 10 minutes. He isn't there either. We're kind of baffled now because there are no other logical places he would go. I decide to run back and check the car and the bathroom again. I meet him halfway before I get to the intersection. He is sweaty and disheveled with a weird look in his eyes. I say, "Where have you been?" He says that he went to the bathroom, and when he got back to the intersection that we weren't there, and that he just assumed that we went to the trailhead and started walking, and then met me. I say, "What do you mean? We waited at the intersection for over half an hour and checked at the car, bathroom, and trailhead, and you weren't there." He says, "Well, I don't know. I went to the bathroom." He then asks me where my uncle is. I say at the trailhead, and he asks me again. I tell him again and note that it was weird that he was asking me twice. As we were crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off the riverbank and exclaims, "Oh, maybe that's him," and I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get on with the hike, and it goes by as normal, except that we seem to keep losing things, such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girls' gloves, a water bottle, etc. It's like we simply just forgot about the items and couldn't remember where we possibly could have left them. On the way back, it got dark, and we turned on our flashlights, and as we near the end of the hike after the 2 waterfalls, it begins to seem as if we've been walking for too long. My uncle also confirms this, asking me, "Doesn't it seem like it's taken way longer to get back?" I say, "Yeah, that I was just thinking that." We keep walking, but it still seems like we weren't making any progress. I've been on that trail many times, and as I was walking, I couldn't spot any of the familiar landmarks. It was weird. There was this odd feeling in the air, sort of a slight menacing sensation. It's hard to describe. I remember thinking, it feels like the woods are alive. We remark 3 more times about how long the hike is taking, and start to laugh at it because it felt so ridiculous. After a bit, we finally, and suddenly, find ourselves on the final stretch, and make it back to the car. Now all of this seemed odd at the time, but I just brushed it off. I only just realized how weird those events felt after we got home and my aunt asks my uncle, "Were you camping?" And he says, "Yeah, how did you know?" As we didn't tell them we were going, since it was kind of last minute. She said that she had an odd dream where she saw my uncle in a tent in a forest somewhere, and there was someone outside of his tent. She said that she couldn't see who it was, but knew that there was a presence there. She says that she woke up around 3 and had the strongest urge to pray for him, and she did. My uncle kind of looks at me after hearing that like, "Are you serious?" I honestly don't know what to make of all of this. This story took place in the mid-2000s in Malaysia, when the Nokia 3310 was still a thing and teenage idiocracy was the ruling personality. I was only 14 at the time, and while introverted, I had a group of friends who were mostly in their late teens and early 20s. While this may seem unusual, it is somewhat common for Malaysian teens to have friends with considerable age gaps. One day, this group of friends decided to visit some abandoned flats and condos from a failed development project. The reason? They wanted to try their hand at ghost hunting. Not wanting to be called a coward, I naturally took up on their little excursion. It was planned that we would visit these supposedly haunted buildings on a Thursday night. The night rolls around and there we were, 20 people, including myself, arriving at the abandoned flat. The flat, darkened by grime with windows missing, presumably detached by junkies to be sold for some small change, loomed over them. Group by group, we entered, flashlights drawn. As I recalled, it was around 10 p.m. Slowly, we made our way up the floors, exploring each unit, calling out to whatever might be residing there. The men's group had splintered into their respective groups, their hushed conversations, callings, and the occasional bouts of snickering and laughter echoing throughout the apartments. I stayed close to my group, not taking the chance of losing sight of them for even a second. For about 2 hours we were exploring, calling out to whatever ghosts or spirits we believed were making this flat their home, but we received no reply. At this point we were tired, bored, but most importantly, hungry. After a couple of calls between the heads of each group, it was decided that we would end the night and go have something to eat. So off we went, a small convoy of cars to the nearest restaurant. As we arrived and settled in, again in our own little groups, we ordered our drinks and food and started shooting the breeze. The topic about the abandoned flat was initially on the table, but was quickly dismissed since we never found anything interesting or experienced anything ghost-related at the location. That is, until one of the restaurant servers marched up to our table. His face was stern, and he was pointing at the younger kid who was sitting quietly, minding his own business, and he asked, "Who are you?" No reply. Again he asked in a louder, more demanding tone. At this sudden outburst of questioning, we were all stunned, and had our focus to this server and that kid who was still keeping quiet, with his expression blank. The server turned to all of us and asked, "Where were you just now? Where did you drive from?" A guy from my table told him that we had just left that location. The server looked at us, and still with his eyes on us, pointed to the kid he was questioning, and asked all of us, "Do any of you recognize this kid?" 19 pairs of eyes shifted toward the quiet kid, and it hit all of us at once. None of us knew him. We made a head count and totaled 20 heads, including this kid. My group leader asked the kid's group leader if he recognized him, but he said no. "But you drove him here, right? You were with him, right?" they were asking. "Yeah," he said, "but I don't know this kid." At that, the server turned to the ashen-faced group leader and told him that his friend was still at the flat. He said, "You go return this thing, and you find your friend. Only you and your group. The others cannot come unless you want someone else to be switched." We shifted in our seats, and after what felt like an eternity, the guys at that kid's table got up, went to their car, with the kid following them without asking or invitation. Even after food and drinks arrived for the remaining men, any appetite that we had before had dissipated. The rest of the story was told to me by my friend who heard it from the group leader with the quiet kid. When they returned to the flats, they swept through each floor, every unit, and every room, looking for the missing kid. The thing that switched places with the kid? The entire group dare not look its way, as it tailed behind them while they searched. They felt its presence as they climbed the floors, sensing it growing more and more incensed as they neared the top. It took them about an hour before they found who they were looking for, passed out in a room on one of the upper levels. When they found him, they felt the malicious anger of the presence vanish, and then they mustered the courage to look over their shoulder. The kid was gone. They didn't hesitate in getting themselves out, not even bothering to fully awake the passed-out kid and ask about his condition. One of the bigger guys grabbed him and they all ran, each of them praying to whatever they believe in to protect themselves from whatever resided in that abandoned flat. They got to the car, practically throwing the kid they found in the back seat, and after the engine sputtered to life, the driver buried his foot into the gas pedal and they sped away. As I recall all of this, I remembered a conversation that I had with one of my Malay friends who is a little serious on matters of the occult. His stance when it comes to them: we don't disturb them, they don't disturb us. So don't go snooping around in their territories. I recently went bush camping with my boyfriend on Crown Land near Stone Mills, Ontario. It was our first time doing bush camping, so I sent a video of our campsite setup to a friend. Days after this happened, I talked to my friend, who asked me about the ghost in the video that I was completely unaware of since I didn't take a second look at it after sending. When I had that closer look, I zoomed in to see a terrifying skeleton-like figure. At first, I thought it was a glare on the lens from the fire, but the figure is moving way quicker than the speed of the camera. This place was very deserted, but throughout the night, I heard clear footsteps that sounded human. So much so that I thought that the cops had come to kick us out when I saw a flashlight point at us from the woods. I quickly pointed my light back, but never saw any animals or people. I have been camping a lot and have had deer, squirrels, and raccoons come to my campsite, and their footsteps did not sound like the ones that I had heard. I'm not a believer of the paranormal or anything of the sort, so I didn't even think about it until watching the actual footage. This incident happened to me when I was 14, and I've told the story and gone over it in my mind so many times exactly as it happened that it feels as if it were just yesterday. My uncle, 2 younger cousins, aunt, and I had gone up to the Rocky Mountains to have some fresh air and watch the stars. We went up a lot back then, when you were still allowed to at night. Now that park closes at 10, sadly, and our adventures such as this one ended about 3 months after this incident. Those two things are somehow inextricably linked in my mind. I can't help but wonder. We all 5 piled out of my uncle's AMC hatchback, a tight fit, and stood around the car on the side of the dark road talking about life and joking about Mothman. Betty, my aunt, was the first to hear a noise in the woods across the road to our left, but we dismissed it as an animal, and the adults and I, being older and in on the joke, tried to scare the kids. But a loud crash came from the woods, when no one had thrown anything, nobody had gone over there, and I'd had my eyes on the whole group the entire time, which meant that none of us were laughing now. My uncle chuckled nervously. Let's get in the car. We got in silently. Something had changed. The wood was quiet except for the sound of the car itself toiling down the mountain, as something followed our car, moving the trees about 10 yards behind us on the driver's side where the mountains slanted down. Nothing but trees over here, I thought. What the hell could that thing be? Feeling the tension in the car, I took matters into my own hands and leaned out the back driver's side window intrepidly. It was still behind us, crashing through the trees and moving through the treetops, right after our car. My mind grew curious. Go faster, I urged my cousin Brian. He sped down the winding road, but the thing in the forest followed. I looked at the speedometer. 35. We could do this. Go faster, I said. It was keeping pace, but always just behind the car. I was livid that I could not catch a glimpse of whatever was big enough to make such a racket and bend the trees to its whim. I finally yelled at him to go faster, but again the thing kept up. Our tiny car was racing down the winding mountain road, sheer rock on one side of us, certain death on the other, our headlights the only things lighting the way down as we sped out the gate of the park, turned, and peeled down the paved road toward town. The kids were in tears. Brian nearly was too. Betty was silent, something which, if you knew her, you'd know the gravity of the situation when she actually chooses to shut up. Brian was yelling back at me and asking me what that thing was as I crawled back into my seat and buckled up. No, I said dejectedly. I couldn't see a thing. Months later, I tried to talk to my family about the occurrence, and found that none of them even remembered it except Betty. They had blocked it out of their memories, I guess from sheer shock, the poor souls. Even to this day, my uncle and younger cousins don't even want to talk about it. Looking back now and having watched a lot of Bigfoot investigations since, it's a likely possibility that what I didn't see was a Sasquatch. However, there were things even weirder than that in this local area. I was with my niece, who's on her high school soccer team and is taking it pretty serious and attempting to get some kind of scholarship out of it. I'm pretty healthy, but don't really work out too much. Something I often do is run and hike. I live in Kentucky, not in a rural part, but there is a state park near my house that's about 6,500 acres, so it's pretty secluded and densely forested. There are some really nice trails that allow you to run for a good chunk and then hike for a bit to split up the long bits of the trail that are flat. She decided to tag along with me today for a quick 3 or 4 mile run. It was raining, but nothing too heavy, kind of a spitting rain. Nothing we couldn't handle. We got up to the peak of this one hill, and it had been about 2 miles or so according to our phones, so we decided to turn back and head back to the car. As we were headed down the steep side of the climb, we were walking pretty slow, making sure that we didn't lose our footing, when out of nowhere there was the coldest chill that came up from behind us once we made it about halfway down. At the time it happened, we both commented on how cold it was on our backs, but didn't make too much out of it and went on with our conversation. In these woods there's some wildlife like small deer and I believe maybe some coyotes, but they tend to stay away from the paths. At least I've only ever heard them in my many years of coming here, never once seen any more than a few footprints. Once we got off of the hillside and hit a stretch of trail that was flatter ground, we began to pick up the pace when a deer darted across the path maybe 10 yards max in front of us, causing us to stop in our tracks. The first deer was then followed by 3 more, and not one of them even so much as looked our way. My niece looked at me puzzled because of the oddity of it. And to me, they were acting as if they were running from something, a predator of some sort. Once they had gone, we started back with our run, and we heard a noise behind us. A loud booming sound of something of substance falling to the ground from some height. When we stopped and turned, we saw nothing. No animal scurrying away like one would expect after a substantial noise in the wilderness. In fact, everything was calm, eerily calm. Just as we looked at each other to ask what the hell that had been, there was yet another cold wind gush through the valley, pushing all the rain off the leaves surrounding us and soaking our sweatshirts. I was starting to freak out inside, but was doing my best to stay calm for my 17-year-old niece. I'm pretty sure she could tell, though, that I was freaked out. I tell her, "Come on, let's get to the car." And we take off again, and there was a man leaned up against a tree on the side of the trail, dressed in a black suit with a white button-up shirt on. His collar was opened, but he had a tie on, sagging like a tired businessman on the way home from a long day. It startled me at first. I was not expecting to see anyone for a few reasons, one being that we were at least a mile away from any parking lot or street, another being that we had never heard or seen him coming, and the stretch of trail that we were on was flat and open for a good half-mile. I got over to put myself between the man and my niece as we jogged past him. When we did, I looked him in the eye and gave him a "how you doing" nod as we went along. He was sort of pale. His eyes were very white, but his irises were ice blue. Everything I saw from the quick look that I got close up looked to be clean-cut and proper. I did not notice a speck of mud on him anywhere, and the two of us had it caked on the bottom of our shoes and even on the back of our pants and shirts from kicking it up on us as we ran. We had to get to the top of another hill, smaller than the last, but still quite the hike. Once at the top, I took a quick look behind us, and he had seemed to vanish without a trace. Now, with having the vantage point of the hill, I could see out past the trail and see most of the trail that she and I had just come from, yet he was nowhere in sight. I scanned the sides of the trail, and still nothing. My niece asked me who that guy was and why he was out so deep in the woods wearing a suit. Questions I simply did not have the answers to. We made it back to the car with nothing else out of the ordinary happening to us on the trail. As we got to my car, I pulled the keys from my pocket and unlocked the doors from maybe about 10 feet out. Walking up to the only car in the entire lot, I noticed muddy footprints coming away from my car from the driver's side. Weird, considering I had no mud on my shoes when we got there. But there are trails leading up to the lot, so I figured maybe someone had came through before we got there and I just didn't notice. However, when I pulled the handle to open the door, it was also caked with mud underneath, as if someone had been attempting to open my door with a muddy hand. Nothing more occurred, but the whole encounter leaves chills covering my body the more I think about it. My family lives near a very large conference center in northeast Georgia. Due to COVID-19, the conference center has been shuttered and abandoned since May. This is a sprawling property with over 900 acres of forest, lake, and wilderness with a few large hotels and a dining room, auditorium, etc. It's been around for about 50 to 60 years, although my family has only been in the area since the 90s. My girlfriend and I decided to explore the property, since it's been abandoned for months now. The entrance is very securely gated. There's no way to get past the front gates without a bulldozer, so we walked through the woods, leaving the car at the top. We walked through the parking lots to make sure that no one else was there. The location is very remote, so it would be extremely unlikely that anyone would visit on foot, especially in the middle of the night on Thanksgiving. We got access through an upper exterior door, and we started poking around the main hotel. It was completely abandoned, but left in good condition. It was spooky, as the only lighting came from the red glow of the emergency exit signs. We looked in many of the other rooms, and everything seemed neat and orderly, like guests could check in at any moment. We reached the main lobby, and then we both heard it, and froze. We simultaneously heard what sounded like a music box playing deep within one of the halls. Neither of us believe in the paranormal, but we both froze dead in our tracks and looked at each other, our faces confirming that we were both terrified. We bolted as fast as we could through the upper door, making sure that it closed securely behind us, and fled on foot. The music 100% sounded like it was coming from a music box, but it was also vaguely metallic, almost like it was a different frequency than most music. Due to the way that it sounded, we ruled out that it could be a forgotten cell phone or a computer. This was not any type of alert or notification made by an electronic device. There's also no cell phone service out there. Usually, I can find a logical explanation for paranormal phenomena, as I'm admittedly skeptical about it. However, I cannot figure out for the life of me what that music could have been. There was no one else on the property. There were absolutely no signs of squatters, and there's no music boxes in the hotel rooms. They are all intentionally identical, so there would have been one in every room. Does anyone have any insight on this? We were genuinely terrified, but now I'm regretting not investigating further. When I was 14, I went camping in the summer with the Girl Guides. We only traveled a few miles away to a place that we had visited a few times for game nights. Each year our guides would merge with the 2 others in the area for a huge campout that lasted about 5 days. The place we were staying in was rumored to have a ghost in the main house. The story says that it only shows itself to members of the family. We were staying on the large estate near the woods, right away from the house. I had been there quite a lot, and knew the grounds pretty well, which was awesome. I was staying in a tent with the younger girls. They were aged 10 to 13, because I didn't have my own tent like the other older girls. The first night went by smoothly. We built a climbing frame, lit candles in the dark, and pretended that we had landed on an alien planet. It was a silly, fun game. The next morning, me and one of the other girls get up early. Our group job was to collect firewood for breakfast, so we ventured into the woods on our own. We were joking around, grabbing sticks and stuff as we walked along. We ended up at the obstacle course and decided to play on it for a while, even though it was out of bounds. When we were done, we grabbed the firewood and started walking back to camp. The woods, to me, they felt and looked strange. It was as if the place was slightly different. I decided to start trying to scare the girl that I was with, just messing around, trying to spook her because it was funny to me. She got really scared and ran off and left me behind. I wasn't bothered as I slowly walked back. That was when I saw movement to my left, and then again up ahead. As I was about to leave the woods, I saw a man out of the corner of my eye. He was wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, carrying something long. I think it was a shotgun. There was no one there. I just shrugged it off. Stuff like that doesn't bother me. I've seen strangers out in the woods before. Once out of the forest, everything goes back to normal. I looked back and the woods were as they should have been. Not like they were moments ago. I don't know how to explain it. They just seemed newer for a while. Not as wild, I guess, but everything was kind of grainy, misty, except that there was no mist. So I don't think anything of it. I enjoy the camp out, we play games, sing songs, and just have a good time. On the second to last day, we play the game. We landed on the alien planet, and once we had breakfast, we had to go hide in the woods, build a shelter, a fire to make food, and people had to go steal food from the campsite without being seen. I am left in the woods on my own for ages as the other girls go around gathering the food. I built a pretty awesome shelter, but I realized I needed my penknife, which I had left in my tent, so I went to go get it. I get to the tent to find the kids that I was sharing it with, crying their eyes out, terrified. Eventually I get the story out of them. They had been making their food when a man, wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, had appeared and then vanished in front of them where I had seen him. I assured the kids that it was fine, and that it couldn't hurt them, and they eventually went back into the woods, but they were obviously very shaken. I got the blame for telling them a scary story, but I had only tried to scare that one girl at the very start and hadn't mentioned anything about the man to anyone. That night was the campfire. As it ended, we all ran through the pitch-black woods back to camp, leaving the person looking after us all alone in the forest. She had a light, so it was no big deal. She had to make sure that the fire was out as well. I found out a week after that she had been horrified walking back to camp and refused to go back into the woods again after that. She has refused to camp at that site ever since, but she won't tell us what she saw. The last day, I got bored while packing everything up. After all that had happened, I was in a ghost hunting mood, so me and 2 of the other girls go into the trees. I'm in the lead, and I'm walking along a path. I stopped and heard footsteps in front of us. Clear footsteps, walking on dead leaves, but no one was there. No one was anywhere near us. I followed the sounds along a path. Someone had heavy boots on. It was so bizarre. We all had trainers on. The girls I was with were silent. They could hear it as well. I followed the sounds around to a clearing at the very edge of the woods, where it stopped. I decided to sit down in the grass. The others followed me, but they sat behind me because they were scared at this point. I do the whole, "If anyone is there, could you give me a sign?" routine. As I finished, a white mist suddenly fell over the woods. You could see things moving behind it, though nothing was clear. It hung in the air as the other two girls ran off screaming. I sat for a minute and watched before saying thank you. As I said this, it was as if a gust of wind hit, and it disappeared. There was no wind. It was just amazing. That was the last of the strange stuff for that camping trip. We had to finish packing up and left the camp that afternoon. I've been back a few times since, and nothing else strange has happened. The woods have always felt normal. A few years after that, I found out that I'm actually related to the family who owned the house and estate. I'm always curious if the activity picked up because I was staying on the grounds. I'm going to preface this post by saying that paranormal experiences are not unknown to me. I have seen ghosts many times over my life, and my mom claims to have seen me playing with them as a child. She was a psychic medium, so I spent a good deal of my childhood around this stuff, but those experiences are for another time. This is just to assure you that I have had experiences with the paranormal before, and that what I experienced I consider to be abnormal generally, as most of my experiences up until now have been positive, or at least neutral. This was a few years ago in my very early 20s. I'm in my mid to late 20s now. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since a little while after my mom passed away when I was a teenager. I was starting to think the things I had experienced didn't happen at all. General denial. One night, on a whim, while driving around a suburb near my house, I managed to convince my boyfriend to come with me to the local cemetery. I was going through a bit of an edgy phase and thought that going to a graveyard at night would be cool. This is a cemetery in a big city, and it's extremely large. I didn't believe in ghosts hanging around in a cemetery, so I thought that it would be fine. I believed that ghosts usually hung around the places that they died, or places where they had unfinished business, and that it was very unlikely that they would actually be in a graveyard. It was sometime in October, but not Halloween. We got to the cemetery around 11:30 p.m. We had our phones with us and were using them as torches. We hopped the fence to the cemetery and began to look at all the graves, pointing out the most interesting ones and kind of just messing around. The place was completely deserted, as cemeteries tend to be at that time of night. We walked further and further in and entered a part of the cemetery where the graves were quite a bit larger and much older. By now it had likely been around half an hour. As we were walking down the path, my boyfriend commented that there was a strange smell lingering around, which was extremely weird, as my boyfriend cannot smell at all. He lost his sense of smell due to a bunch of infections and other problems with his ears and sinuses as a kid. I couldn't smell anything, and I have an above average sense of smell, so we both just shrugged the experience off as just weird. Later on, I was looking at one of the graves when my boyfriend shook my shoulder and pointed at one of the largest graves a few meters into the distance. I'm terrible at knowing where people are pointing, but this time I spotted it right away. It was a little girl, I'd guess around 11 or 12 years old. She had very dark brown or black hair that looked well cared for and quite long. She was sitting on top of the grave, with her legs dangling over the edge. At first I saw her wearing a lacy white dress, like a nightgown that a rich girl might wear. It looked old, but I'm no expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly how old, but maybe the 1900s, early 1900s? I looked away to look at my boyfriend, and when I looked back, she was wearing a different dress. All I remember is that it was red, because at this point, I was super scared. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to me. I felt extremely fearful, and due to the fact that ghosts were very normal for me, this was extremely unusual. I would never feel unsafe seeing a ghost in the past. It was around this time that I noticed that the cemetery was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of bats, and there were a lot of fruit bats in that area. There were no other sounds of animals, and the air felt stale and stagnant. We just stood and stared at the little girl for what felt like an eternity, weirdly transfixed, and then we both ran for it up the path at full speed. I turned for a second to see if she was still there, and she was gone completely. It made me run faster, honestly, and the whole time we were both dead silent. When we got back to our car, we sat there for ages trying to work out what we had just witnessed. We were trying to rationalize it, but as we have both had paranormal experiences before, we knew it had to be a ghost. For a few months afterward, I felt continuously like I was being watched, and had frequent nightmares about seeing the little girl in our apartment. I always felt uneasy. We eventually moved around 30 minutes away, and the feelings and the dreams stopped. I've since tried to research the ghost, but haven't had anything turn up, though there is a local ghost tour at the cemetery, and maybe the guide might know something. Ever since then, my paranormal experiences have been more frequent, and have been getting more unsettling and disturbing. My boyfriend has been experiencing things more frequently as well. Me and my friends went into the forest that's in my backyard. We went at least 5 minutes deep into the woods, down to a stream. We looked across the stream and saw a log, or at least what we thought was a log. It might have been, but one of us pointed out that it seemed to have turned its head. We ran as fast as we could back out of there. This was during a sleepover. We went to sleep around 3, but I ended up waking up around 4 after hearing a noise. I saw a shadowy figure that immediately disappeared once I laid eyes on it. I haven't seen anything else since. It could have just been my imagination, but I could have sworn that I did in fact see it. And it had the same outline as what we saw from a distance earlier that afternoon. My friends and I told me that I was just being paranoid, but I don't think I was. So I checked it out again in the same place, and the log figure was gone. So I still feel as if that thing were not after me, but after one of my friends. 2 years later, and still, I haven't heard or seen anything of it. Although every now and then, I do get the feeling that I'm being watched. I've been getting a little less sleep, but I think that might just be the fact that my sleep schedule is trying to adjust, but I still don't know what that thing is, and whether or not it was real, or if it was just part of my mind playing tricks on me. But again, I don't think that that was it. Remember when I said I hadn't seen anything of it since? Well, I lied. The other day I went back into the forest, and there it was, in the same position that me and my friends had seen it in 2 years ago. I brought them over there, and they confirmed that they were seeing the same thing. It did not look over this time, but I've had an uneasy feeling ever since. They started to stop with the feeling 1 year afterward, but when I saw it a few days ago, the uneasy feeling increased. I don't know what it is, or what it wants, but I don't like it. It's not anything I've seen in any paranormal YouTube videos or anything else about the paranormal, which leads me back to believing that it wasn't real. But my friends confirmed that it was real, and I'm not questioning what they said. So it was real, and it was scary. I hope the uneasy feeling goes down soon, and if the thing ever comes near my house again, I'm going to call the police. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the morning after the sleepover, I saw not footprints, but something else that I can't quite put my finger on. Something that no human foot could ever have made. I have no idea what it was, and don't plan on trying to figure it out. This happened a few years back, on my spring break, senior year of high school. I was hiking part of the Long Trail, which goes south from Glastonbury to Bennington, and it was the usual very cold nights, warm, muddy days Vermont usually has in spring, so pretty fun to hike in. I was going to take a day and rest my feet, go swimming in a pond and cool off, so I took a detour onto the Bald Mountain Trail. I got to my campsite around 5, and the sun was setting, so I set up my hammock and rain tarp and made a fire. I made some Mountain House beef stroganoff and decided to just lay down and watch the flames. I hadn't seen anyone since before noon, which is unusual because it's a pretty well-traveled section of the trail. I started to get really uneasy, and it definitely felt like someone was watching me from a distance. I ended up sitting with my back against a maple, facing the fire and holding my camp knife. A few hours later, 9-ish, I heard a really loud crash in the woods, like a plane falling out of the sky or a freight train right next to me. Then dead silence. No wind, no leaves, no owls, just absolute quiet. I remember getting really uncomfortable and shouting out to see if there was anyone out there, but I just started hearing a really subtle, droning noise, like a key being rubbed on a brass string or radio static, but super low pitched. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just watched the moon go really slowly over the sky and the sound get quieter as it got lighter outside. When I could see well enough to walk, I picked up my gear and sprinted back to the main trail and found some people up early and hiked with them all the way back. My girlfriend and I often get bored with our hometown, so we travel our state a lot exploring abandoned places. Some of these places are also deemed to be haunted. I'm browsing on my computer one day, and I find this prison located about 3 hours away from us. We decide to drive out there on the upcoming 4th of July because we figured that no one would be there for the holiday. This prison was very large, with 10 or so buildings ranging from cell blocks to indoor workout areas. All of these buildings were surrounded by guard towers and fencing that was impossible to enter without breaking the chain links. We parked behind these trees in the front parking lot and walked up to the main building entrance used for prisoner intake. Lucky for us, the front door was simply opened, and we could have just walked right in. We passed through that building, and here we are now inside the prison itself. It's a very large, open space with sidewalks and courtyards connecting the buildings. However, there were little things that seemed off about the whole place. Dead crows that lined the sidewalks were the most noticeable. It was like they flew over the prison and just fell out of the sky. Even the graffiti was made up of weird symbols that we didn't understand. We passed all that a little on edge now, and as we walked, I saw letters on the buildings. A, B, C were regular cell blocks. When we passed B, I thought to myself that we should check it out because B is the first letter of my name. Odd thought to have, but I went with it. The cell blocks formed the shape of a T, and in the middle of the T was a guard station with a ladder leading them to the second floor if they needed to go up there without having to interact with the inmates. This upstairs area connected to a hallway that led to a boiler room and a door with stairs leading down the side of the building. I walked up those stairs and past the boiler room, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I got to this hallway. I shined my phone flashlight into the hallway, and even though it was daytime outside, my light only went 1 inch into this area. I felt myself shiver even though I live in the south, and it's 90 degrees outside. I ask out loud if anyone is here with us to make yourself known. I'm sure this was a mistake, but I didn't mean it negatively. I just felt compelled to say it. From this pitch-black darkness, I hear a noise that sounded like something scurrying away, such as a small animal. I figure that's all it was that made me nervous, when all of a sudden I hear footsteps full-on sprinting directly at me. It sounded like whatever it was had massive feet and could run unnaturally fast. I ran out of the building and down the stairs with my girlfriend right in front of me. We both looked at each other and determined that whatever it was did not want us here. We ended up walking around just a little bit more to other parts of the property, but we felt watched the entire time. As we departed through the front door, we felt better, almost as if we were being released from an unpleasant fog of energy. We had sage in the car and burned some, which also helped us feel better. I try not to think about it often, but I do wonder what we encountered. So the area is deep in the Monongahela Forest in Virginia. I was doing some hiking there alone, trying to explore the new area, seeing what's out there. Everything was going pretty smooth in general, except for one occurrence that had gotten me blown away completely. By the way, I'm a 37-year-old male, been hiking in forests and mountains many times, never had an issue. Anyway, so I'm walking in the forest. It was around 4 p.m. I was alone. I had everything on me, including a radio beacon, compass, GPS on my phone, and smartwatch. So as you can see, taking my precautions in case I get lost, so that I can figure out my whereabouts and get back. I also even had printed maps on me. While walking, I all of a sudden felt some sort of weird, very weird quietness. As if you know it was the vacuum. No birds chirping, just quietness. And what's extra weird about it was that it was so quiet that I could hear the humming in my ears that you sometimes get to hear in total silence. I'm thinking, okay, quite odd. First though is that there might have been a predator in the vicinity, so I was trying to keep an eye out for that. I did carry something to protect myself with just in case I got attacked. Anyway, I just keep walking. No predator, but the quietness was just there. It's strange. I did not even see any birds anymore, just trees. I also noticed that the weather started getting worse, it became cloudy in an odd way. I don't know how to explain it. Long story short, the weather got bad pretty much out of nowhere. At this point, I kind of started feeling I don't know how to describe it, I guess uneasiness. I decided to go back, and here's this. All of a sudden, the GPS is out on both my phone and my smartwatch, and the compass is spinning as if there's a magnet close by or something like that. That got me very concerned because it pretty much means that I can't find out where to go in case I get lost. I started walking back. None of my navigational tools are working. I'm kind of still going back, just kind of orienting myself by the way that I came in. All of a sudden, I see the clouds above are really bizarre. It's like most of the clouds are weird and grayish in color, but they're not like clouds, but more kind of like fog, which is really way up. Then there was another cloud kind of surrounded by gray clouds, which was black. I've never seen a cloud look like that before. It was almost like the night sky. Then the craziness happened. All of a sudden, I hear music. Like a town clock bell or something like that, doing it every 10 seconds or so. I don't know, at the time I just got scared, really freaked out, and I just started running very, very fast back where I had come from. I was sprinting, and then eventually I noticed that the weather got better. It was no longer cloudy. The clouds weren't in fact visible anywhere near. I looked at my compass and GPS, and it was back up. I was, in fact, headed in the correct direction. After that, I just went back to the place where I had parked and left. Later that day, I looked up the weather forecast for that area. There wasn't supposed to be any cloudiness anywhere. It was supposed to be a sunny day with only sporadic clouds. I told my story to my buddies, also hikers. They say it might have been that I could have maybe fallen and maybe had a dream of that, but I don't think so because I don't remember falling or having a dream. Anyways, it's kind of a weird story. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but I don't know. I grew up in rural Oregon with around 70 acres of wooded private property as my personal playground. By the time I was 16, I had spent countless hours exploring every square foot that I could and had never experienced anything any more unpleasant than poison oak and more than a few blackberry scratches. Oddly, there was one small portion of the property that I had never checked out. I couldn't tell you why I had never gone to this one little corner. I just never did. It was like an unconscious choice to just never go there. There was even an old trail or road leading back to it. One afternoon, I got the itch to turn left and follow that trail. The day was bright and warm. Nothing was sketchy or untoward. However, within 50 feet of the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming need to stop in my tracks. It was like stepping on a giant, sticky mouse trap. My feet simply wouldn't carry me any further forward. As I stood there, every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt absolutely sick to my stomach with dread. I spun in place, looking every direction for whatever danger my body was telling me was there. The spot where I stood was a bit of a clearing in the trees. I had about 20 feet or so of total visibility in all directions, and further in some. There was nothing, not so much as a bird or a bug. I've never felt such utter terror and the desire to go full knees to chest for the hills. I made my way back to the trailhead as fast as I could backpedal, and the second my feet left the trail, it all faded. Hairs back down, stomach settled, and zero sense of unease. It was like stepping out of a room and closing the door. For years I wondered what kind of presence I had encountered. Many naysayers tried to tell me that it was probably just a cougar and it was my sixth sense picking up on it. I wasn't buying it. Then, in talking to my parents one day, who used to wander that property when they were dating a few decades ago, I found out that they had come across the remnants of an old homestead there. It had deteriorated to the point where there was nothing left but the outline of the foundation and some old medicine bottles. I had a light bulb moment. Seems that maybe one of the homesteaders was still there, and I was definitely trespassing. I've had short-lived moments of temptation where I thought about going back there and seeing if I could replicate the experience. In all honesty, though, whatever was there was way too dark for me to ever want to encounter it again. It definitely seems best left alone. I live in Lompoc, California. I also live across the street from the cemetery. I used to hop the fence on one side of the cemetery to go to a friend's house who lived on the opposite side of it. If I went around, it would easily be a 4 to 5 block walk to her house. The keeper of the grounds who lived there called the cops on me several times, so I stopped. I also have been driving for years now, so there's no need anymore. Anyways, on one of my walks, I noticed a tree house in the cemetery off to the side. It was in a trench in a deep wooded area. There's been a few nights when I've gone and hung out inside of this treehouse with a few friends. However, every time I went, I would see spirits. I was scared many times, but seeing my friends happy and enjoying themselves was what made everything worth it. Except for one night in December of 2018 when I had brought new friends with me. During this time I was going through a lot and kind of hanging out with a bad group of people, some of whom were with me that night. Like I've mentioned, I always at least see something, but usually only for a few seconds. This time, though, I saw a rather large man, kind of burly yet completely transparent. I felt him before I actually saw him, how sad and lost he was. But I could also feel how gentle that his soul was, and that he was only looking for help or just someone to understand. Since I could feel him, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. After the initial feeling, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. My friends heard it too. I looked over, and I saw this man, and all I could feel was how confused that he was. He started to walk up, but froze once I saw him. I yelled out to him that it was okay and that we weren't going to hurt him. I told him that it was safe for him to be there if he wanted to stick around, but then my friends wanted to leave with how freaked out that they were. I walked out first to be his guide, and he walked in front of me until he disappeared seconds later. I don't think I really helped him, considering that I didn't have much chance being with that group of friends and all, but I could feel just how gentle that he was, like I said. Sometimes I feel that gentle presence whenever I visit the graveyard, and I think of him. Today I went, because today is also the anniversary of me losing a friend. I felt that gentle presence when I visited her grave today. It was my last year of college, and after getting dumped by my first significant girlfriend the year before, I ended up involved with a woman who lived next door. It was not a healthy relationship for either of us, but I think we cared for each other despite not always being good to each other, and we somehow stayed involved for like a year. One morning while we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for the day at her place, she mentioned a video assignment due in a couple of days. She grew up in a large city and was unfamiliar with the sleepy New England region that we went to college in, but she knew that I had gone to high school about an hour away and had family in the area, so she was hoping that I might be able to suggest somewhere interesting to get footage. I suggested that my parents were buried in a pretty cemetery near the high school in town, and that I hadn't stopped to pay my respects for a bit, so I'd be happy to drive her over there after classes. She liked the idea, and we agreed to meet up in the afternoon, grab some dinner, and go by the graveyard so that she could take her footage. Only we kind of screwed up. It was probably late fall by that point, and the days were getting noticeably shorter. If I remember right, service was slow at the restaurant too. By the time we were getting into my hand-me-down Dodge Grand Caravan to head out to the graveyard, the sun was going down. Not ideal for shooting some quick, amateur footage for video class. As I said, the graveyard was near the high school, which was a little outside the town proper. You passed the school, and then there was this windy road kind of into the woods and up a sizable hill or small mountain overlooking their football field. About halfway up, there was a turn off into the cemetery. It was a peaceful little spot, and my grandparents had plots next to each other. I had visited a lot in the daytime in my first couple of years of college. My grandmother had passed away when I was in high school, but my grandfather lived on a few more years until passing away early into my first years of college. Since I was nearby, I visited him a fair bit as his health began to decline, and in retrospect, I really value those opportunities to spend some one-on-one time with him, even if I feel a little guilty for not appreciating it at the time. I was a snotty 19-year-old and didn't realize what a cool guy that he actually was, and how lucky that I was to be part of his life in that way. After he died, I continued to stop by the cemetery several times a year to check on their grave sites and pay my respects. I had been to the cemetery a lot, but never after sundown. There were two entrances. The main one that took you through the center of the graveyard, and a side entrance that led out onto a little road, just big enough for one car that was a straight shot to my grandparents' plots. To the left of this little gravel road was an open field with newer looking graves, and to the right was a more overgrown area with older looking headstones, and the real tree line for the woods beyond that. Even in daytime, because of the brush and the shade from the trees, it always looked dim off that way, and my sister and I had both remarked about how it was kind of creepy over there. So this woman I was seeing and I were driving to the cemetery at sundown, just hoping that we'd be able to get in and figure out how to get some footage for her assignment. The main gate was locked, but the side entrance was open, which was better for us anyways, since it was the more direct route to my grandparents' graves. I pulled the minivan in slowly, careful to stay off the grass as much as possible, and we stopped and got out at the intersection nearest to where my grandparents were buried. She got the camera she had checked out from the school's library equipment room, and was trying to get some footage of the headstones or something while I walked over to say hi to my grandparents. only it was too dark, and after a couple of minutes she asked if I would turn the headlights on to see if the light would help her get something usable. Not knowing how long we'd be out there, and not wanting to drain the battery, I decided to just go ahead and turn on the engine too. After a few more minutes, the van started acting weird. It wasn't a new vehicle. My parents had bought it before I was in high school and had given it to me years before, so I was pretty familiar with the sound of the engine idling. That night in the graveyard, the engine began to make unfamiliar noises. It was very high-pitched and loud for an idling vehicle. That immediately raised concern for me because the last thing that I wanted was for the van to break down in the middle of the cemetery where we may or may not have been trespassing. I started to walk back toward the van to investigate. As I walked toward it, though, the headlights began to flicker rapidly. It was sort of an inconsistent strobing effect, which was like a what the heck kind of thing. They had never done that before, and never did it after. Same with the engine noise. Then I heard something even more disturbing. To my side, off in the wooded area with the older graves, something started moving around in the brush. I looked, and in the darkness, I swear, I saw movement to accompany the sound. I couldn't see what it was too dark, but something was coming slowly towards us out of those woods. I instantly felt as if it was time to go, and that we shouldn't be there. Fortunately, my companion agreed, even though she hadn't got enough footage, because she heard the approaching rustling as well. We got into the van, which continued to sound really weird, but thankfully it went into gear and drove normally as we got the hell out of there. The lights stopped flickering as I got turned around, and the engine sound returned to normal as we approached the gate. The most rational explanation for the rustling was an animal, but that didn't explain the van acting so strangely. I kept it for another 6 months before trading it in, and it never made noise like that while idling again, and the headlights were always reliable, never flickering. I also have had other strange experiences in my life, but this was the first and only time I ever felt that overwhelming sense that I had to leave or that I shouldn't be somewhere. I can't help but wonder if both my sister and I had always thought that wooded spot off to the right was spooky for a good reason, and if I might have found out what that reason was had my companion and I stayed for a few more minutes that night. The area where I live is a heavily wooded Indian residential area, and we have no neighbors, and the closest town is about 15 minutes away. The only animals that come around are coyotes, black bears, sometimes wolves, and since I live in the southern part of Canada, there aren't any mountain lions that I've seen anyway. So a few nights ago around 2:50 a.m., I heard my dogs barking like crazy, and I got pretty annoyed by this because they never usually do it. It was hard for me to sleep, and I pulled out my phone to check the time, and like I said, it was almost 3. Since my bedroom has a window, I opened it to call my dogs back, and they didn't stop barking. I tried a few more times, but then I heard a sort of wailing, crying sound from the woods. I heard foxes can sometimes make screaming sounds, but this didn't sound like a fox's cry. I don't think it could have actually been a woman, considering, like I said, that we don't have neighbors. I tried telling my grandfather, but he doesn't hear it, and when I told my grandmother, she didn't want to talk about it since she can sometimes be superstitious. I have a story from about 2 years ago that really captivates me to this day. When I've told this story to close friends, they tell me it's straight out of a movie. I can't really disagree with that. This starts when I finished my first year of college in the Bay Area. I worked my ass off in school and I just wanted to have a wild summer, and I would do anything I could to get out of the house. My cousin was and is my best friend, and we basically did anything and everything together. When there wasn't anything to do, we'd take walks together around my rural neighborhood. I always lived near this old hospital, which used to operate as the biggest trauma unit in my area. Sometime when I was in high school, they shut the hospital down for some reason that I still don't know. It basically just sat there rotting for a few years before we found it. One day we were drinking a cold one and taking one of our routine walks and ventured away from our usual route through this peaceful, random field. We stumbled across this huge parking lot after making it out of the field, but it didn't hit me that this was the old hospital's parking lot that we had found. We made our way through the lot until we saw this massive building standing on the outside. The deteriorated banner said emergency room, and this was when we knew we had struck gold and stumbled across a back route to this abandoned hospital. We knew of this place, but we had never been here. We hadn't heard any weird, outlandish urban legends, nor had anyone that we knew been here before us. We pushed forward and checked out the perimeter. To our surprise, the first door we walked up to had a rock jammed in between the door frames so that we could just waltz right in. This was when it occurred to us that it could be a potentially bad idea if we got caught, and we could suffer some consequences. We agreed we would be quiet and respectful and make it a quick trip. This is where things take a turn. Or a few turns. We entered the building and it was the most deafening quiet that I had ever experienced. The sound of the door closing was like a literal bomb going off. Once the echo stopped from the door, it dawned on us that this place was straight up creepy. We walked slowly, but the floor is covered in glass, which makes even the smallest of steps sound like Bigfoot lumbering around a library. We found a patient room, which still had a bed inside. We stopped at the doorway to look in because the floor looked sketchy. Out of nowhere, from around the corner, we heard the faintest, slow, drawn-out whistling. I've never in my life stopped what I was doing so suddenly. I just stared wide-eyed at my cousin because even a whisper sounds like yelling in this place. We both have our feet planted to the ground, because if we move, then we too will make ourselves known. At this point, we both assumed there could potentially be a squatter or a guard of some sort. My cousin hand gestures to me that we have to leave and we can't just stand here because the whistling was obviously not going to stop. We turn toward the opposite of the corner that the whistling is at, and we're tiptoeing to a perfect silence. Then the whistling stopped. We freeze again, and we hear the glass crunching from around the corner. We start running. Once we get to the door we came from, we realize we didn't put a fucking rock in the door frame when we came in, and now the door is completely stuck. As we were trying to get this door open, the glass crunching is now running. We hear it until it sounds like it is dangerously close. I am horrified. We turn around to try another door and the noise of the glass is literally right in front of us, yet no one is there. No one. We book it to a door that says pharmacy and peel the door open. The pharmacy is completely empty except a single, perfectly placed and aligned landline phone plugged into the wall. The phone is off the hook and making a dial tone. The whole thing is so perfectly lined up and centered with the whole room, I've never seen anything like it. And the dial tone was so loud in such an empty place. There wasn't power throughout the hospital, so how was it working? I was in complete shock. We left and never went back. I had heard of some other kids going there at night. They told me that they also heard the whistling and thought someone was lurking in the shadows the whole time. It is a freaky world out there. I live near one of the oldest cemeteries in Portland, Oregon. It's pioneer era. The oldest graves are from the 1850s and it's still active today, funerals all the time. Anyway, I go walk and jog through there pretty often. I usually jog a couple miles and then finish up with some wind sprints. There's a spot where it's straight for about 60 or 70 yards, so I'll do 8 or 10 of these things and then quit. The spot where I usually start running from is right near the grave of a young boy who was born in 1896 and died in 1902. I've done some research, and all of his family is actually buried in a different cemetery, so I always feel a little sad about it. His name is Carl, and it's weird maybe, but I talk to the kid's grave as I'm resting up between sprints. For whatever reason, that's the only grave in there that I've ever paid much attention to, and about the only one that I'd ever done any research on. Not sure why exactly. A couple weeks ago on Wednesday, I was doing my thing. I stopped at my normal spot, said hi to Carl, and instantly got this sickening feeling that I was in danger. I looked up at this tree, big old oak, branches around 1.5 feet in diameter. I was absolutely terrified, and I started running and got the hell out of the way. I was absolutely 100% sure that this branch was going to fall and kill me. I waited a few minutes, and came back over and started looking at this big oak tree and the horse chestnut right beside it. I couldn't decide which tree actually was going to fall, so I sort of blew it off as paranoia. Not really a credible premonition or whatever. The next day, on Thursday, I go for a run, avoiding that area. When I finished up, I went back and stopped next to Carl's grave. It was a little later than I usually go, mid-afternoon, and it's getting pretty hot out, so I wasn't really looking forward to running more. I didn't actually hear anything, but something told me you shouldn't go any further. So it's hot, I'm tired, I'm paranoid. I noped out and went home. The next day, it's Friday. I go back into the cemetery. A massive branch from the oak tree had fallen, knocked about 5 branches off of the horse chestnut. It all landed on Carl's grave and right on the part of the path that I usually jog on. Some parks workers were already cutting the trees up to clear the way. I asked one guy when it had fallen, and he said it had happened sometime on Thursday afternoon. I have no idea if I actually would have been there at that time at that spot, but it was weird enough to freak me out a little bit. Anyway, thanks, Carl. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went camping in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people that I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted one another. We had been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized that we had bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we had changed course and gotten off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground. It was the kind of place with hookups for RVs, picnic tables, it had fire pits and grills, and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or another house. There may have been a few other small groups, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark, and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a 1/4-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes, followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet away off the trail. There was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad, and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were really freaked and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but this was long before any of us had ever experimented with any mind-altering substance. Regardless, I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth, and then walked back together in complete silence. When we got to the spot that I had seen, whoever he was gone without a trace. The water pump was still there, though. No one had noticed it before, because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed really scared. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what occurred. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. So who's to say? This was a pretty surreal experience for me, and the few people that I've told agreed that perhaps someone was watching over me and warning me. A couple of years ago, I lived in a place close to the sea. At night, I used to take my dog down through the town center to the seafront for a nice walk. I eventually discovered that there was a small graveyard with gates on either side which I could cut through. I kind of like walking through graveyards, especially at night, because it is creepy in a very cool kind of way. I did this quite a lot, and never once felt afraid. However, one night I was walking up to the gates, and I felt the strongest feeling of dread. No reason for it. Nothing was different. But it was like something was screaming at me to not go through. Do not walk through the graveyard tonight. I didn't. I turned around and went the other way. It was such a bizarre sensation, given that before I had walked there plenty of times without meeting anyone, with nothing happening. I genuinely believe that if I had ignored that and walked on through, something would have happened. Who knows what, or what was lurking there that night. I never went that way again. Some people have told me that I had a guardian angel who was warning me of the danger. Not very far from my home, there is an abandoned place, which is my hideout. I honestly don't know what was in the place before it became abandoned. The place is a rather small, probably like 40 by 20 meter fenced off, overgrown field with just one building. I can't tell what the building is either. It's a really small, house-like place with no windows and one locked door. The field itself has a small, short sidewalk that has been taken over by nature. There's also a small hill in the field. You can tell that the place hasn't been visited for a really long time, because the grass in there is quite overgrown, and the house, fence, and path all have plants growing all over the place. Since it's currently spring, a lot of the foliage is growing and blooming, and there were some wildflowers in the area as well. Today I took some scissors and went to the area with the intent of picking some flowers to make a cute bouquet to put in my home. As soon as I entered the area, something felt off, and I suddenly became paranoid. I ignored the feeling since I have mental illness which causes me to have random paranoia at times. Keep in mind, though, that it doesn't cause hallucinations. It was still unusual for me to feel paranoid there, because I would usually go there to relax and be calm. It's basically my safe spot. I went on to look around and pick some flowers, but then I heard some footstep-like noises behind me everywhere that I went. I brushed it off again, assuming that it could have been an insect or a small animal like a hedgehog or a rabbit. I felt like I was being watched the entire time, but again, I assumed that it was just my random paranoia. The thing that scared me the most happened when I was about to cut a big, white, pretty flower. The only one of its kind in the whole area. As I was kneeling down to cut it, I suddenly felt a human presence behind me. This caused me to jump up, drop my bouquet out of shock, and yell out, "Whoa!" and turn around. To my surprise, nothing was there. I was very confused, since the presence felt awfully real. I picked up my bouquet and went home. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path. Past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement, and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts, but at the same time it was a beautiful day, and I still wonder whether there was some kind of adventure waiting for me if I took the forest path. What do you think? I was driving with my daughter from Atlanta to South Carolina, and we were about 30 minutes away from home. I was very familiar with the area because I've traveled there countless times. As we passed by a church, my daughter said, "Did you see that lady?" I'm like, "What lady?" She explained that there was a woman walking among the tombstones in the graveyard. I'm like, "Let me turn around and see." Now, I had gone just a minute or so down the road before I turned around so that I was sure to see her. As we got to the church, I slowed down almost to the point of stopping, and there was no one. I turned around and actually stopped in front of the graveyard, and nobody was there. Now, this church was very isolated. There were no other houses for at least a mile or two. We didn't see any cars that might have been broken down, and there were woods to the back of the church. Like I said, I know this area, so we think that it was the spirit of a woman who was buried there. You have to ask yourself, why in the hell would a woman be walking around in a graveyard at 3 a.m. in the morning? No houses for miles, no disabled car. Very spooky. By the way, my daughter sees spirits, and she's an empath. My grandpa was always a big hunter. It's not uncommon here in the Midwest. He would always find new areas to hunt and get permission to hunt on private properties. So one day, him and his buddy got permission to go on this private land that I believe was around 100 acres total. I don't recall the specifics of exactly where the forest was. For now, I know for a fact that this was in the Michigan-Indiana border area, or in other words, Michiana. Anyways, they set out around noon to get to the forest and arrived at around 1 p.m. and started hiking back into the woods. They each had their own tree stands or blinds set up prior, so they made their way to them. I remember my grandpa telling me that they hiked a few miles back, so they had to have been deep in the woods. As the day goes on, they don't see any deer, so once the sun began to set, they decided to start making their way back to the truck and met up near my grandpa's tree stand. This is where the weird stuff happens. They're making their way back and the sun has completely set. Luckily, they brought flashlights for the walk back because otherwise they would have had to have walked a few miles in pitch black. Anyways, they finally have about a mile of hiking left when they see something or someone crouched in front of them with their back turned to them. My grandpa described him as a bald white guy wearing a black and white striped shirt. My grandpa's friend speaks up after a moment that I can only imagine as a "what the heck is this feeling?" and asks what he's doing out there, and without a word, the man stands up and faces them, stares, then levitates up toward the trees, and disappears. After that, they sprinted to the truck, and never went back to that land again. I know it's not the craziest of stories, and sounds so weird, but I know for a fact that my grandpa did experience this. My grandpa's not a liar, and it was never some scary campfire story that he told us grandkids. When he told me, I could see in his face that it was disturbing him, and is something that he can never forget. I took my young kids to visit my grandparents' gravesite for the first time. They were really freaked out to learn that dead people were buried underneath all the headstones. The headstone kitty-cornered to my grandparents was for a small boy around 4 or 5. When I noticed the age, I heard a whisper in my ear to talk about the kid. As I said, my kiddos were already really freaked out. I didn't want to add to the experience of learning about dead kids. I heard the whisper 2 or 3 times before we left. When we got into the car, my son said, "Who was that boy standing next to Grandpa? He looked really sick." I instantly had chills and got super emotional knowing that my grandpa was there with him. Me and some friends went to an abandoned mental asylum at night, not really expecting much. We busted in through one of the boarded-up windows, and when we were inside, we all heard talking. We figured that other people were there, so we followed the sound. We were walking down the hall and heard a woman whispering, "Why did you take my baby?" over and over again. At this point, I was visibly shaking, and we all believed we found where the sound was coming from originally. We go to this room, and there was a huge cage. It looked like one of those pet carriers, only human-sized. I don't know what actually happened that night. I don't really believe that dead people were talking in there, but the sheer creepiness of it all was just too much. I've always had some kind of interest in the paranormal. As someone who grew up in a religious household but has always struggled with the concept of faith, I think what's always drawn me to it is the idea of proof. Proof of something beyond this life. Proof that death isn't the end. So I guess that's what set me up for this experience. This was 4-ish years ago on an October night. This happened with two friends of mine who I'll call Jim and Lisa. I've known Jim since 2nd grade, and Lisa since high school. Lisa and I went to the same college for a bit, and we had a mutual interest in the paranormal. Given the time of year that it was, close to Halloween, we decided to go and do some ghost hunting of our own. I called up Jim, who also had some interest, and planned to meet up and drive to a local cemetery not far from where we were. So this place definitely has the spooky factor to it. It's on a residential road, but the section the cemetery is in is really wooded and separated from everything. It's set back on a hill, and carved into the hillside right up against the road are the keeps that they used to lay bodies out in when the ground was too frozen to do burials back in the day. Jim and I had scoped this place out during the summer during the day because it was close to where he lived, so I kinda knew the layout. We all met up and parked next to it. I had brought a voice recorder from school. I worked at the school radio station, so it was fairly nice. We started walking around and asked some innocuous questions. Lisa claims to be sensitive, which I'm skeptical of, but that will come into play a little later. As we were walking around, kind of creeped out, we walked toward the back of the cemetery. It goes fairly far back, so we were poking around reading stones with flashlights when Lisa and I could swear that we heard someone walking around near the middle of the cemetery. All three of us were together near the back, and there was 1000% not anyone else out there. Could it have been some college kids hyping themselves up? Maybe. It's hard for me to really confirm with hindsight whether we were being overly imaginative, but we were pretty sketched out. After about 15 to 20 minutes, we figured that we should pack it up. Lisa and I were kind of freaked out still because we were fairly convinced that something was walking around near the center of those headstones. She also kept saying that she felt like something was compelling us to leave, and that we weren't welcome. Jem was kind of indifferent and wasn't really noticing anything super crazy, so we started making our way down the hill. This is when a weird thing happened. As we were walking down the hill, I heard a stone skip past me as if someone had kicked or thrown it. I figured that it was just Jem, as he's apt to do that sort of thing. But as I looked and was about to say something to him, he was about 10 feet to my left. He definitely didn't kick anything at me. The weirdest stuff that we found was on the recorder when we got back. I want to make this clear, this was not a super windy night. There was a light breeze at best. But the recorder sounded like it was windy as hell because we caught a ton of what I call interference. It was really deep bass tones that sounded like the microphone on the recorder were being overloaded. The creepy part was that there were times where there was a rhythmic quality to it, like something was speaking but couldn't get through fully. I'd say it sounds like when someone's talking in another room with the door shut, where you can hear the noise, but not much in the way of actual words. I did get it on the other investigations with this recorder, but never at that level. So while it's possible that it could have been an issue with the recorder, I'm not entirely sure. We also got some really direct, creepy EVPs. Toward the end of our time there, you can hear me on the recorder saying, "Hey guys, we should go," in reference to the creepy walking sounds from the middle of the cemetery. During the discussion from the three of us, there's a moan that's pretty audible that no one heard while we were there. It sounded like something was upset that we were leaving. This was reinforced by a minute later when Lisa asked, "Do you want us to leave or do you want us to stay?" And a voice pretty clearly answered, "Stay. I want you to stay," which was creepy enough to hear in general, but the whispery quality to it makes the hair raise up on the back of my neck. The epilogue to this is Lisa claimed that there was weird stuff happening all around her house the weekend after we went. Banging on the wall, noises in the other rooms. Full disclosure, Lisa does have a bit of history with mental illness, so I guess you might could chalk it up to that. The part that gives me pause is that we were talking about this at school one day and her sister called from the house complaining about all the weird crap that was happening. While I think her sister also has some sort of history, I think it's mostly anxiety-based, but I'm not 100% sure honestly. I do find it a stretch that her sister would call and make a big deal out of it if stuff wasn't legitimately taking place. I only wish that I'd gone to the house and experienced whatever it was firsthand just to see for myself. In high school, my friends and I knew a guy named Gene. For whatever reason, Gene had a habit of telling extremely tall tales centered on himself, as if he were trying to make himself look cooler. The most repeated one was his claim that in a nearby ravine, a coven of druids practiced and were schooling him in ancient magic. He always played them straight, as if they were unquestionably true. He never had any evidence. While taking a walk one night, I happened upon a construction site. Being heavily into urban exploration, I explored the heck out of that site, and upon leaving, tipped over their porta potty. I was still a bit immature, and I thought it was funny. After that, whenever I found one, over it went. One day I told some friends about it, and Gene, ever the showman, chimed in with, "Oh, that's nothing. I like to burn them down." Arson was most assuredly not our thing, and we knew that Gene was full of it, so we were just surprised when, calling his bluff, he offered to prove it by showing us the fruits of his labors. 5 of us piled into the car, only one of us had a car, and followed Gene's instructions. The site was in a rural area with lots of big hills and dense forest, common in the Pacific Northwest. At a sharp elbow on a 2-lane road was a gravel turnoff leading maybe 100 feet into the woods to a gravel parking lot. This was the starting point for a number of hiking trails. There were no lights there, and the street light out on the road didn't show very much through the trees. Also, there were no other cars. One of the trails began past a gate that was designed to keep off-roaders from the trails, and it took a sharp left turn from the back of the parking lot. The porta potty had been about 30 feet or so up the trail, and on a later visit by day, we found out that Gene really did burn it into a puddle of blue goo. That night, we didn't make it there. We had a couple of flashlights, and we all started up the trail as a group. As far as I can recall, we never heard any noises, animal or human. We got about halfway to the spot, then all of us stopped walking. Someone whispered, "Do you feel that?" And we all bolted down the trail, piled back into the car, and got the hell out of there. Once on the road, we compared thoughts. I felt what everyone else did. The deepest, most intense, raw fear that I have ever endured. It was like we suddenly faced impending death. It clearly indicated, I need to leave right this instant. I can only guess that there might have been a cougar or something, as they've been known to attack hikers, but we saw and heard absolutely nothing. I've read that if a little voice in your head tells you to do something, it's a good idea to listen. Part of me wonders if Jean's porta-potty fire pissed off some forest spirit or something. I've been back to that trailhead a few times during the day to show friends where this happened. I've also brought a friend who's quote-unquote sensitive, as they say, and they didn't pick up anything. I've had a few odd experiences, including seeing a couple of ghosts, some strange lights in the sky several times, and some other stuff. This is the only unexplainable experience that I've had which was deeply scary. This story took place during my childhood when I was about 12 years old. A few days ago I thought about it, and still don't know exactly what it was, and what I should think. It's not the most spectacular story, but anyway. I grew up in an apartment that was pretty outside the city and close to a forest. We had a lot of greenery around, and we were always playing and sometimes also camping outside with friends during the summer. So one night, me and two friends decided to build my tent and sleep outside. We were always then staying up really long and telling ghost stories. While we did this, we suddenly heard noises from outside the tent. We were all holding our breath. Then we could hear steps. They came closer and closer, and then the steps even went around our tent before stopping. We got really scared and said, "Whoever you are, go away or we will call the police." It seemed to work because the steps continued and headed away from our tent. After a minute or so, we then tried to be brave and go outside the tent to see who it might have been. Then, when we looked out, we saw a woman, dressed in a long, white gown, walking away in the dark. I still don't know who or what she was, but it continues to give me chills. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was little, so basically it's my mother's and my uncle's version of it. When I was 4 years old, I was really sick. I basically couldn't digest the food that I ate, so my body had no defenses. I even spent weeks in intensive care at the hospital. The thing is, nobody knew what was wrong with me. For a year, 3 different doctors were trying to figure out what was happening. They made me do a lot of tests, even for rare conditions, but they were always negative. My mom was completely desperate. In her own words, "You were gonna die before I could even figure out what was taking you away." One day, my mom was with me at my uncle's house. He's my dad's brother, and he lives with his wife and the mom of his wife, who was like a grandmother to me. So this old woman told my mom that she was beginning to think that I was possessed by a spirit. I live in a place with a lot of esoteric beliefs and traditions, especially followed by the old people. She asked my mother if she remembered going to the cemetery while she was pregnant with me. At that moment, my mother remembered that she had gone to bring flowers to her father's grave on the day of All Saints. There's a legend here that if you go to the cemetery while you're pregnant, or with a newborn baby, the spirits will try to possess it so that they can get to live again. My mom and uncle threw me into the car to take me to a church known for such cases. They said that I was screaming and crying the whole way in the back of the car. "Let me get out, I don't want to go there." I didn't even know where we were going, or why, since they didn't tell me anything. My uncle was driving, and suddenly, we hit a traffic jam. He tried to slow down the car, and then he realized that the brakes weren't responding. He kept stepping on the brakes without the car responding until we were about to hit the car that was standing right in front of us. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Then the car stopped completely, just inches away from colliding. When we were sitting still, the strangest thing of the trip happened. They both felt as if several people from the outside of the car were pushing the car, shaking it to one side and the other. I was still screaming. Long story short, we arrived to the church. I didn't want to come in, but I finally did. I was crying all the time. When we got out, I was in a much better mood. My mom bought me donuts on our way to the car. I ate one and then puked, but it was as if I had puked up something with sandy texture. Something completely dry. My uncle stopped the car and got me out in case I was going to keep getting sick. Suddenly, I did a strange sound. It was like a burp, but way too loud and deep sounding for a small 4-year-old kid. I'd like to start this off by saying that I'm an absolute skeptic, to the point where I've always secretly scoffed about paranormal activities. But I can't explain this. I met my husband in a little dive bar that he was managing. We clicked instantly, and he's a very outdoorsy guy. We got together a couple times, then he officially asked me out on an overnight hike. I had a 10-month-old St. Bernard pup, who of course came with. We drove up way past Cougar towards Mount St. Helens and parked on the trailhead leading to Bolt Camp. It's just a little shelter along the Lewis River about 5 to 6 miles in. We packed all our gear, and even a backpack for my dog, and headed out. I can't stress how beautiful that hike is. Massive Douglas firs covered with moss. Sometimes, there were little wooden bridges crossing streams along the trail. My husband would always yell, "Watch out for trolls," when we crossed them. We got kind of a late start, so the sun went down, and it was almost completely dark by the time that we arrived. There were so many hollow stumps, the setting sun would shine through them, and they lit up inside. They looked like little hobbit houses with fires burning in their hearths. And the mushrooms, my God, there were bioluminescent ones that glowed green in the dark. It took forever. He kept saying that it was around the next bend, but it never was. We finally arrived and unpacked, and it was awesome. You can look up Bolt Camp online. It's a wooden 3-sided shelter. You'll even see my saint in one of those pics. A tree had come down on it at some point, and the pics you see of it partially smashed are how it was for us. It was still more than intact enough to sleep in, though. People leave stuff at Bolt Camp for the next folks. Someone had left half a bottle of scotch. We partook in that, and when we left, we hung a little baggie of weed from the rafters and some beer and water. Anyway, we made a fire and cooked steaks on rocks, got drunk, and fell in love. I fell asleep first. I slept towards the inside of the shelter, my now husband and dog toward the outside. It was late October, and while it was dry, it was very, very cold, and the fire refused to stay lit. Eventually, he fell asleep too. My Saint Leo kept growling into the dark, and they bonded over that. "What do you see, buddy? What's out there?" They were both asleep when I woke up. Thinking it was around 2:30 to 3 a.m., I was facing the back wall of the shelter. Then I saw it. A wispy, gossamer, cobweb-looking thing floating to and fro in the back of the shelter. It would flip and spin and turn over itself. It was so beautiful and fascinating. I wasn't scared. I really, really wanted to wake him up, but I barely knew the dude and was afraid he would think I was nuts. So I watched it until I fell asleep. Morning came. I never mentioned it. We fed the dog, ate a bunch of trail mix and cheese and sausage, and hiked back. I dropped him off at his place. Like I said, we fell in love that night, and moved in together a couple months later. We were reminiscing about our awesome hike when he decided to share something with me. I dropped him off that day at his house. That same evening, he was out on his porch having a smoke when he saw something. A cobwebby thing, turning over and over on itself, floating back and forth in the street lamps. He found this interesting. He watched it, and finally it settled into a clump of bushes. He went to take a closer look, and a pair of glowing red eyes materialized, and he decided that he wanted no part, and ran back indoors. This is a man afraid of nothing. Anyway, I obviously immediately told him about what I had seen, and how I was too embarrassed to share before. The similarities are just too great. It had to have been the same thing. A couple of years ago, me and some friends had a short-lived phase of trying to go and explore as many cool, abandoned places as we could. One of these was a very old hospital that had been closed for roughly 20 to 30 years, I believe. It was pretty central, in a big town, so it was quite regularly maintained as far as terms of boarding up windows, doors, etc. to keep people out. Our first visit started with us climbing through a window near the middle of the building. We pried a plyboard board up from the window, but as soon as me and 3 other friends got in that room and opened the door into the main hallway, we agreed pretty quickly that we shouldn't be there and left. Unusual for us, as we quite clearly weren't scared of much if we were easily able to break and enter into a building in the middle of town. We'd also never been scared and anxious of anywhere before, and it's weird that all of us agreed that we should leave straight away. Our second visit is where it got properly weird. We went back about 2 weeks later, and all of the plyboard on the windows was replaced with metal sheets, which isn't strange for a building in a large town where people break in regularly, apart from the fact that the window that we went through originally was completely open. We climbed through anyway, and got all the same feelings again, except when we tried to open the door into the hallway. It was locked, and felt as if something was pushed up against the other side of it. We went back through the window, and I was last. As I was about halfway out of the window, I heard a young girl's laugh, pretty much directly behind me in this small room, and I nearly fell out of the window trying to get away from it. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me at first, until one of my friends asked if I had heard that laugh, and that's why I jumped through this window. All my other friends had heard it too, and said it sounded like it had come from inside the room. All of this is pretty normal stuff, and I'm sure that the door being locked or having something behind it was just someone moving stuff around inside if them and their friends were exploring too. The young girl's laugh that we all heard from the room we were in, and how we felt on both visits, is what we can't explain. I always visit my son at the cemetery, usually at night. I love how peaceful it is there, and just look at the clear, starry sky. Today has been a rough day for me. I cried and prayed on my way to the cemetery. First, I noticed how bright that the moon is tonight. I usually have to use my phone's flashlight so that I could see where I'm going. Not tonight. My son has a toy box on his grave. Letters, books, and toys are inside. It's a little plastic tote. The lid wasn't there when I got there tonight. It was on the ground. Today's weather wasn't really nice. Everything must be wet, I thought. But no. The card and the letter that's sitting on the very top were dry. The teddy bear was dry. It couldn't have been the wind because the papers were there. I don't know if someone opened it and left it open, or something else. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved. Tonight, I'm sitting here at the cemetery, totally at peace. On Labor Day of 2015, my mother, my wife, 3 children, and I went to a very remote cabin that we had rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, So it had the cabin and 3 other sheds and shops. I'll try to keep it short now, but this is a really bizarre story. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and decided to take a walk a couple of 100 yards down to the river. We were all barefoot, wearing sandals with shorts. We got down to the pebbled shore and were playing, throwing rocks, etc., when I realized that there were 1-foot snakes everywhere. My wife, mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance, I went back with a water bottle and caught one of them to see what it was. It turns out we were in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, then surely they would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin and my mom and I went for a hike alone while my wife calmed the kiddos and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my wife and kids were inside with the doors and windows all closed, even though we had opened everything up to cool the place off. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards from the cabin, huffing and puffing at the wife and kids on the front porch while they were eating. It was down by the river, another 30 yards or so down the hill. A few hours go by, and in that time, an ATV passed 3 times with 2 inbred-looking freaks on it, and each time they stopped in front of the gate onto the property and stared at us or the cabin. Keep in mind, again, we're hours into the wilderness in Idaho with no sight of a person the entire trip except for them. We decide it's bedtime for the kiddos, as it's pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly fine, active, and talkative to having a fever of 103 degrees, slightly foaming at the mouth, and being completely unresponsive. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door of the cabin to start loading the 2 cars, and that's when we heard 3 adults and what sounded like 4 or 6 large, heavy animals running all around the cabin and property. There was one on the right side of the house, when exiting, that I could hear pacing back and forth, breathing heavily. I made everyone stay inside and close the door every time I went out to transfer stuff into the vehicles, which took me about 4 to 5 trips. I had a stick in a big pot that I was smacking as hard and loud as I could each time and was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I finished the loading, I took out each kid individually and loaded them into the cars. Then I escorted out my mom, and then my wife. My wife and I were in the lead car, so we pulled up out of the gate, and for some stupid reason or other, I felt that I needed to close it. I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it, and my mom's car by about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now this gate is literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered 0 protection or barrier between me and the animals that sounded like they were out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud padded footsteps walking up to me. Directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet, I see eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I have ever heard in my life rumbles through the air. I turned and ran so fast I swear that I must have jumped from where I was to the driver's seat of my car some 30 feet in front of me. As I landed in my seat, I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving. It gets weirder and scarier, though. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son. We both kept having this horrible, evil doom kind of feeling, like a shadow over us. I looked down and realized that I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle in my cup holder, so I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we softly hear our son begin to cry. We realize that he's become responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was sad to leave. He couldn't even remember the last hour. The next day, my mom broke down extremely badly, sobbing her eyes out, and was hardly able to even speak. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip. We came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said that she knew a lot of bad things happened at that outpost, and that it was full of evil. Most of all, she said that one of our kids died. I swear on my life to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me, or anyone else, anything more. She lives her life now with a guilt that she willingly ignored her premonition and put us in that situation, nearly taking the life of one of her dearest grandkids away. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. I know this all sounds insane, but a week later on the local news were reports of a wolf pack in that area. Wolves and bears may not coexist in harmony, but they do share territories and tend to respect each other. This outpost station of sorts was 1.5 hours into the wilderness from Loman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify that these animals actually exist around there. I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre-early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have a half a sleeve of the wilderness and trees on my left arm. With that said, we don't care to go to the mountains anymore. Moving from a small town to a large city at a fairly young age had to be one of the biggest adjustments I've ever had to make. I knew no one. I had no idea how different it really was. I had no reason to think about it before we had to move. Not only was the way of life much different, but so were the people and the experiences. There were so many more buildings, cars, and people in general. And the dangers that lurked only just began to come so real for me. I've always had strange things happen to me that couldn't be explained, but I would always just shrug them off. I would play it off as if I was just tired most times and making myself see things that were not really there. Besides, I had no one to talk to about these strange encounters, and I was a young teenager. Who would really believe these outrageous things that I would just seemingly come up with? The church-going family that we were just wouldn't allow for such nonsense. The Lord protects us from all evil, that kind of jazz. On moving to the city, I eventually got settled after some time of rebelling. I was your normal, typical teenager, and I was angry because I felt like I had been made to leave my friends behind. I got into a lot of trouble and fell into all the wrong crowds. The whole stereotypes that people have of teenagers. I seemed to allow myself to live up to that stereotypical standard. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't care. I found myself in some sticky situations that finally led me to a friend that showed me that what I was doing wasn't getting me anywhere with my life. For this story, we'll call him Bob. Bob was an older man. He was, I would say, at least 12 years older than I was. I was 13 at the time that we met. He had moved in downstairs from us with a friend of his that my parents knew. We met while helping his friend move furniture out of his apartment to have his carpets cleaned. Fast forward some time and Bob and I became close friends. Yes, it was odd myself being friends with someone so much older than I was, but somehow it worked at the time. There was this cemetery that was up the street from our apartment complex. We would go there regularly to visit graves and help clean them and place flowers on those that were unmarked to show that someone still cared for these people. We would always go during the day. It was such a beautiful and peaceful place. There were many rose bushes, green grass, tall shrubs, and some really pretty water fountains spread out across this large piece of land. It was easy to just stroll around there all day and lose track of time completely. One day we came upon this one tall, mass grave that was unmarked. It was so old that the headstone was crumbling, and the lot that it was on was caving in and had a hole about a foot or so deep just underneath the concrete slab. We were both curious about it and would visit the grave a few times this one week. We weren't sure what it was about this grave that drew us back to it each time, but we visited this person quite often. I can recall this time that we had gone later in the day. It was just an hour or so until it got dark. We were never there when it was dark because they locked the gates, and if they found you there after a certain time, they would kick you out. But they never saw us or bothered to tell us to leave. We were of course at this unmarked grave once again. Nighttime had finally fallen, and it was pretty dark. There were a few lights in the cemetery, but it was just a soft glow that filled the area we happened to be at. Bob and I wandered around that unmarked grave, and were admiring the other headstones around it. We just couldn't believe how old that they actually were. We ended up circling back, getting ready to head home. We walked back past the unmarked grave to say goodbye. I remember standing there on the side of the grave, where the hole was. I was just thinking, how could they not fix this, and wondered how far down that it went. Being the curious idiot that I was, I kneeled down next to this hole and decided to stick my arm into it. It was so deep that you couldn't feel any kind of gravel or soil below. I guess Bob had just kept walking, so there I was with my hand in this hole below this concrete slab. I stood up and went to turn around to walk toward Bob. He was a ways off in the distance, but I could still see him. Before I could take a step, though, I felt like my body wasn't moving. It was as if someone had a huge hold on me. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was stuck. Bob finally notices me standing where he left me, and starts yelling for me to come on. But there was no moving for me, and I felt this grip just getting tighter and tighter. It felt like forever watching as Bob made his way back in my direction, going on about how he wanted to get home, how it was late. He was standing in front of me and looked at me like I'd completely lost it. He had been talking to me and asking me questions, and I, of course, could not move or make a sound. He reaches out to grab me to pull me along, and I didn't budge. As we stood there, he kept talking to me, seemingly thinking that I was messing with him, and he was laughing. Tears began to roll down my face. All I could think about was, how am I going to get this thing to let me go? Did I make it mad? I just kept apologizing in my head, saying how sorry I was for disturbing them, and that if they let me go that I would never bother them again. I'm assuming that they must have known that I was sorry for what I did. I dropped to the gravel, and I quickly bolt up and take off running. I ended up leaving Bob behind. He came knocking on my door the next day to ask what happened. I had no idea how to even explain what I had experienced. All I know is that I have never bothered that grave again. I was in a nearby abandoned Navy hospital with several friends. We had been in many times before and never had anything odd happen. We were on the top, the third floor, and there were many broken windows, allowing the rain and nature in. There was a lot of mold and even moss growing in the old ceiling tiles that covered the floor at this point. One of our group, prone to asthma and respiratory issues, didn't take it too well. We all decided it was best to leave and began our descent into the basement, which was the route to the exit. This is when things got weird. I broke ahead of the group, something generally against our rules of exploring, but in my mind I had to get out. I was far enough ahead, around corners and such, that I couldn't even see their flashlights behind me anymore. My heart was racing, and I still don't know why. I finally got to the last door that led to the room that we would exit from. It was a heavier door that closed by itself. I reached for the doorknob, but something stopped me. I couldn't do it. Something in my mind wasn't letting me put my hand on the knob. All I felt was terror. I'm not sure how long I stood there, shaking with my hand no more than 3 inches away, before I saw the flashlights of my friends at the end of the hallway, and at last, I could do it. I wrenched the door open and immediately went outside, hyperventilating with panic. My friends soon joined me, also saying something felt a little weird in there that time. We were gathering outside the door when the friend with the breathing issues felt something on her shoulder. We pulled down her shirt and there was a noticeable, quite obvious handprint. Nobody touched her, especially not hard enough to leave a full handprint through clothing. We've been back several times and haven't had another experience in any way, which only makes it even more odd, if you ask me. A few years ago, I was on holiday in the south of France with my boyfriend, now fiancé, and his family. We stayed in a small village about half an hour inland. One afternoon, me and my boyfriend went for a walk around the village and came across a church cemetery, so we went in to have a look. It wasn't creepy or anything, as it was just daytime, and it was right in the middle of the village, and there were a few cars going past and several people walking around. The cemetery was interesting to us because it was different to a British one, as there were little tombs the size of a garden shed around the edge that were very old and had whole families buried inside. After walking around for a while, we walked up to one of the tombs that had no glass on the door and looked inside. You couldn't see anything odd in there. There was a cross on the wall and a vase that would have had flowers in it. But the smell and the atmosphere changed right outside that tomb. It made us both feel ill, like a sudden sense of dread overtook everything. The air seemed stale. We left quite swiftly, and I felt as if we were being followed after that, until we left the cemetery and got back onto the pavement. When I was 16 years old, I'm female by the way, my friends and I decided that it would be fun to go out to an old abandoned farmhouse that was rumored to be haunted. We didn't really believe in ghosts at the time, but were fascinated by the thrill of potentially experiencing something paranormal. So on a hot summer night in July, we decided to take 2 cars out to this abandoned place. There were 6 of us in total. It took about 45 minutes to drive there, so we left around 2:15 a.m. because we wanted to arrive at the farmhouse by 3 a.m., witching hour. To get to the house, we drove down a dark, winding country road with houses few and far between. There were no streetlights, so although it was a warm summer night, it felt incredibly scary as we drove through the unfamiliar place in the pitch black. As we arrived at the house, I nearly felt sick to my stomach. I didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal at the time, like I said, but something in my gut just felt wrong. The house was situated at the bottom of 2 hills, and there was no driveway in front of it, so we had to park at the top of the hill where there was an area off to the side of the road covered with crushed rock. We got there just in time to fulfill our plan of arriving at witching hour. As we walked down the hill, we saw the house. It basically looked exactly how you would picture an old abandoned farmhouse. Exposed gray wood, pieces of siding falling off, and old, overgrown plants all around the entrance. There were 2 levels to the house. The first level had 2 windows on either side of the door, and the top had 3 windows, one to the left above the door and to the right. As we walked closer, we saw that the door was open, so we dared each other to go inside. We formed a line to enter. 2 of my friends, who were guys, went in front of me, and I was the third in line to enter the house. The first guy is friend number 1, the second is friend number 2. As we enter, I immediately felt ice cold. I have never felt that kind of cold in my life, as in, I felt it all the way in my bones. As soon as I felt it, I heard friend number 1 scream at the top of his lungs. It all happened so fast that I could barely make out what it looked like inside. I mostly remember an uninviting couch laid across the stairs with the living room to the left of the stairs and the kitchen to the right. It was like walking back in time. Old floral wallpaper peeling off the walls. So the second that friend number 1 screams, we all run out of the house immediately. As I look back toward the entrance, I notice that only friend number 2 exited the house behind me and friend number 1 was still screaming inside. Like blood-curdling, in fear, scream. Friend number 2 runs back into the house and grabs friend number 1 and pulls him out. My first friend was so scared that he ran from the house screaming that something was holding him up by the air by his shirt. He rips off his shirt while he's running, and all I see are 3 big tears in the back of it. It looked as if 3 prongs from a pitchfork had ripped through the fabric. But it doesn't end there. As my second friend stepped foot outside the door, he begins yelling in pain. I looked back, and he had blood dripping all over his face. I literally felt like I was in a horror film. He came toward me, and I was in full instinct mode. I took my sweater off and gave it to him to try and stop the bleeding. He just yelled at me that something had hit him in the nose, and that he needed to get to the hospital. So we run back up the hill, which felt like 1,000 years, to the car. When we get into the car, I get friend number 2 tissues and clean up his nose, and I shine my light on it to see what was bleeding. His right nostril had a clean cut all the way through it, as if someone had taken scissors or shears and cut it. And it gets worse. As we're driving away, my friend and I both look to the house, and there's a candle lit in the top left window. Then, as I look to the other side of the road, I still want to cry when I think about this. I have the image and feeling just burned into me. And there's this old trailer with a light on, and the silhouette of a man with a hat on in the window. I am 100% convinced that this old man was an evil spirit. Just the feeling I got of him staring at me, watching me as I drove by. I still feel the chills when I think about it. I felt like it was a warning to never come back to his property. Like he was the spirit that hurt both of my friends, and that he was sending me a message. On the drive back, we ended up bringing my friend to the nearest ER, where they stopped the bleeding and stitched up his nose. He still has a scar from it, and his right nostril looks as if it were dog-eared from where it split apart through the stitches when it healed. A good buddy of mine, Andy, and I went for a hike around our local quarry. We took a trail that we hadn't taken before. It had really awesome lookouts and a crazy graveyard that we walked by. It was super cool. We also hiked around to this other awesome spot with big rocks to climb. Then we decided to head back to the car. As we were walking back, Andy said that he felt like he had just walked through a giant spider web on the trail, but he couldn't see or feel any strands to pull off. I said, "You just went through a portal," jokingly. He said, also half-jokingly, that he felt like he might have. Then he said that he started feeling a weird static electricity. This was strange because I was feeling the exact same thing. We were walking, and seriously, it felt strangely just intense with jolts of energy going through both of our bodies. Our plan was to take a break at this cool wooden deck down by the quarry water. It was about halfway back to the end of the trail. The plan was originally to chill there for a minute and listen to music on the water, but after that happened we were freaking out and wanting to see if we could feel that same electricity again. So we went back the way we came, and actually took another way back to the trail. We didn't feel anything this time. We had walked just far enough to kind of dismiss what had happened, but then we got back to the same spot where it had happened before. As soon as we started walking up the trail, all of a sudden it was like everything got so quiet, and it felt like we had walked into a cloud of energy that was even stronger than before. There was even an audible buzzing sound in our ears. It seriously made both of us stop in our tracks and say, "It's happening again." But this time, it was not a very good feeling. Like, I've never had a feeling of, do not go that way, that intense before. We turned right around and walked the heck out of there, spooked as hell. When I was about 4, I went to the local cemetery with my aunt. She went there often to take pictures because there were some pretty spots there. She was taking photos of my cousins and I ran off, and when they realized I was missing, they yelled for me. I came back and they asked where I had been, and I said that I had been playing with my friend Angel, and that I would take them to her grave. I did, and even though I couldn't read, I told them details about her that I wouldn't have known unless I had been able to read her headstone. Since then I've looked into the girl and found out that she's the sister of some people around my age, who I know in my town. She was 4 when she died. I still look for her headstone every time I go to the cemetery, even today. When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him, in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed "raccoon" at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward and said sorry to me and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who, just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school. Only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill, and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other. I live in Oklahoma, and I'm really big into finding abandoned places and exploring them. I found out a few months ago that there is a forgotten graveyard a few minutes away from my house. I've lived in Oklahoma my whole life, and I've never even heard anyone mention this place before. So I looked it up and did more research on it to make sure that I wasn't walking into something crazy or where I could possibly be harmed. I found out that it was the site of an old schoolhouse, and that there was no marker, so people had basically just forgotten that it was even there over the years unless they had a loved one that was buried there. I waited until daylight to go just in case, because I wanted to be able to see everything around me since I was in the middle of nowhere. I ended up asking my sister if she wanted to go with me so that I wouldn't be alone. And God, am I glad that I asked her to come, because I never thought I would have saw what I did. We woke early the next morning to go before it got hot because it was summertime. It was 10 minutes away from the house, so it was an easy drive. Finding the exact location was the hard part. Once we did find it, we pulled up and got out and started to look around. The grass was all overgrown, and you couldn't really see any of the headstones anymore. We had to be super careful walking around because we didn't want to step on anyone. We explored for about an hour or so, and then we stumbled upon this opening where the old schoolhouse used to be. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it sounded like someone or something was running right at us. But there was no one else around. And mind you, again, we're in the middle of nowhere. So we stop what we're doing and back up a bit to look and see. Neither of us spook easy, so we just looked around and we didn't see anything. We decided it was getting too hot to just stand out there for much longer, and so we started walking back to the car. Again, it sounded like something or someone was running at us, but faster this time. We both took off sprinting to the car and didn't stop until we got in and locked the doors. As we sat there, I looked up more about this place, and it's known by a few people to have major activity, and it's so bad that they actually tell you not to go at nighttime. I read stories of people who said they had seen figures walking around, or someone asking them for help and then disappearing a few minutes later. I'm glad that I decided to wait until daylight, and that I asked my sister to come with me, because I don't know what I would have done if I heard someone that I couldn't even see running at me if I were alone. I've never been back to this graveyard. It actually kinda scares me to even think about going back after what happened. When, though it wasn't anything serious like some of the other stuff people had said happened to them, maybe one day I'll have the guts to return. This is a completely true story. There was one time about 2 or 3 years ago. I was out in the woods camping with my brother, and we had just gotten there around 4 p.m. to set up and all. Once we had settled in, we got a fire going. I told my brother I was gonna go get some firewood because we only had enough to get it started. So I went out, and it was around 7 p.m. Then I got really cold all of a sudden, even though the weather was not cold at all. When I got the sudden rush of coldness, I felt a heavy feeling of just pure evil, hatred, and despair. I immediately went back to my brother. He told me it was fine, that it was probably just a strong wind, that had given me a chill, but I knew that something was wrong. We sat around the fire, and I just felt like someone or something was watching me. Once again, I started to feel the same feeling of evil, but this time faintly. It slowly started getting worse and worse, almost as if it were growing inside of me. I brushed it off and went back to bed. At around 2:20ish in the morning, I heard something that sounded like a scream, and it woke me up. I looked around in the tent and got a flashlight. When I turned the light on, I noticed that my arm was bleeding and had been cut open by something in multiple spots. I woke my brother in a panic and told him what had happened. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, and my arm wasn't even cut, even though I was looking right at it and it was obviously slashed open and bleeding. I said, "Are you joking?" And he continued to say that nothing had happened to me and that I was just pranking him. At that moment, I felt a huge amount of pain in my arm, and then I heard the scream again, but it didn't sound like how a human would scream. It was more of a screech, as if there were an animal or some creature in the distance that was in pain. I looked at my brother and asked if he had heard it, and he asked me, "What do you mean, did I hear that? There was nothing." At that point, I was afraid for my life. I was praying that nothing else would happen, but after a few minutes, I heard the scream again. Every time I heard it, I would feel that dread, that evil again, and my arm would start to have a burning sensation. Eventually, all of it stopped, although after that, I wasn't able to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my brother that I wanted to leave ASAP. When we went to get into the truck, I could have sworn out of the corner of my eye that I saw something run through the woods. I looked to the right while packing the stuff up, and 4 of the trees had marks like they had been clawed by something. But the thing is that the marks were at least 12 feet up in the trees, maybe higher. I was so tired and scared that I couldn't even think about it anymore. I just got into the truck, and we left. To this day, I still haven't gone camping again. When I was 13 or 14, I was staying in a hostel in Ireland. This hostel was directly next to, supposedly, one of the most haunted places in Ireland, an abandoned mansion. In fact, the hostel was built from the bricks of the mansion. There was a story that a widow cursed someone in there, and when they died, they remained. After hearing this, being a young and dumb kid, I decided to taunt the ghost. Big mistake. Nothing happened after I taunted the ghost until I went to bed. That night, in the very right side of my bed, I heard light breathing. I paid it no mind because I've had experiences before, and breathing was not a huge alarm for me. I eventually fell asleep, and then I got a phone call on my phone at 3 to 5 a.m. Likely family from back home in the US. I didn't answer the call, and I tried to go back to sleep, but there was a problem. My comforter had fallen off the bed, to the right side of the bed, and the breathing was loud and raspy now. At this point I was frightened because I had never heard breathing that loudly before, and it just wouldn't stop. Needless to say, I didn't get my comforter out of fear, and it was a good thing that I didn't. In the morning, I was shocked by what I saw. To the right of my bed was the comforter laying on the ground, and it looked as if there was a human underneath it. I could make out the arms, legs, and head. To this day, I genuinely believe that if I had reached for my comforter, something would have reached back. About 4 years ago, I took my dog for a short hike. It was about a mile walk from the car to the beach along the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington state. The trail led us through the tall cedar trees, and then to a large clearing which led to the beach. My dog and I played on the beach for a while before I decided to head back. We stopped and took a break at a picnic table in the middle of the clearing. My dog, being the monkey she is, was standing on top of the picnic table looking around when she fixated on a spot across the field and her hair rose on the back of her neck. Always one to trust my pup, I became extra observant. As we stood there, a black mist appeared out of thin air to our right. I watched as it took on a long form roughly the size of a human. It glided across the trail and dissolved. It was really like looking at a small black translucent cloud. It scared the crap out of me and my dog, and I boogied back to the car. I've never found an answer to what the black mist was. I travel to many different cemeteries for work in Massachusetts. I'm a grave salesperson and go to these cemeteries on an as-needed basis. One day I was finishing up a sale and decided to use the bathroom in the tiny office shed in the back of the cemetery. The door to enter the office was locked, but the bathroom door was broken and wouldn't close all the way. I didn't care that the bathroom door wouldn't really close because no one was coming into the office anyway. It was late, and all the groundsmen had went home for the day. Just as I was finishing my business, the bathroom door slams shut, and since the knob was broken, the door just bounced and swung open. My first reaction was that someone had entered the office and the air pressure had sucked the door open. I run out and see that no one had come in. There were no open windows to cause a breeze. This door just slammed and opened all on its own. I was shaken up, but I still had some paperwork to complete. I acknowledged that there may be a presence in the room with me, but I didn't want to appear frightened of it. So I sat down in there for a few minutes and took my time finishing my work. Nothing has happened there since then, but I always acknowledge the entity as if it's watching over the place. So I found this old, abandoned, broken-down house in the woods close to where I live. I've only lived here about a year. I was alone walking around it, trying to see if I could have a peek inside. While I was walking around and whatnot, I felt a bit scared, but I pressed on. I found a way in, but it smelled so much of mold that I just decided not to bother. Anyway, the point of the story. When I was about to leave, I felt this sensation of sadness wash over me. I stopped and turned around and looked at an open window of the house from about 10 meters away, and I swear that there was a woman who stood there being in pain from the state of her house. I stared and was almost about to cry for a few moments as I walked away, but then I stopped and looked back again. I almost felt drawn to the house, not wanting to leave. But as soon as I got away from it and was walking back home through the forest, the feeling of sadness left. On a side note, the day before I had walked through a part of the forest where a lot of trees had been cut down and a lot of branches and bark were scattered all over the ground. There I also felt such sadness, as if the trees themselves were crying. As I'm writing this, I realize that I sound kind of insane, but I have never really felt this way before, and I feel normal like one day later, like today.